Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us at this special meeting of the Madera City Council. If we can have roll call, please.
Mayor Andy Medellin,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Jose Rodriguez,
Here.
Councilmember Cece Gallegos,
Here.
Councilmember Will Oliver,
Here.
Councilmember Derek Robinson is in the building, just not at his seat, Councilmember Charles Rigby,
Here.
and Councilmember Donald Hawley.
Present.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll stand with me, please, for the invocation led by Councilman Donald Hawley.
Thank you. Most Lord, gracious Father, again, we come thanking you for this evening. Thank you for those who are present. Lord, give us counsel, the strength and guidance that you have placed over us and our staff. In Jesus Christ's name we all say amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mr. Councilman. If you'll join me in the pledge, please. Ready, salute. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
I got it. Thank you.
Moving into public comment, the first 15 minutes of the meeting are reserved for members of the public to address the council on items which are within the subject matter jurisdiction of the council. Speakers shall be limited to 3 minutes. Speakers will be asked to identify themselves and state the subject of their comment. If the subject is an item on the agenda, the mayor has the option of asking the speaker to hold the comment until that item is called. Comments on items listed as a public hearing on the agenda should be held until the hearing is opened. The council is prohibited by law from taking any action on matters discussed that are not on the agenda, and no adverse conclusion should be drawn if the council does not respond to public comment at this time. Is there anyone wishing to speak under this definition of public comment? Seeing none, I'll close public comment and would like to welcome Mr. David Hale, sitting in for our city attorney this evening. Mr. Richardson, thank you, Mr. Hale, for joining us. And with that, I will move into item number 1. This is discussion and direction to staff regarding water conservation revenues and related expenditures and an update to the city's water enterprise revenue requirements and financial plan. Mr. Merchant.
Hey, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. The discussion tonight, as you noted, is related to the water fund. The two elements of the discussion, they were originally conceived as being separate, but because they really interrelate to one another pretty closely, it suited, I think, the council well to have them scheduled for the same evening. So I'll talk about the water conservation program to the extent that it is a discrete discussion item. And then I'll hand the ball off to Habib Isaac from Raftelis Financial Consultants to talk about the financial plan itself. Some background regarding the conservation program and the funding. Back in 2015, when the water rate study was being prepared, the city faced mandatory water conservation requirements from the state. We're looking for ways to help us meet those mandatory targets. And in conjunction with that discussion, water conservation budget dollars of approximately $1 million, or of $1 million, were incorporated into the 2015 water fund financial plan. The effect of incorporating those dollars into the financial plan was to generate an increase in essentially the tiered rates for single-family residential use in Tier 2 and Tier 3. A smaller effect is also in place relative to the multifamily Tier 2 rate and the non-residential, or the commercial rate, you might say. The overall effect of the water conservation funding, as you have been told by other folks, is relatively small in comparison to the cost of, say, capital improvements or general maintenance and operations, but it does affect those those higher tiers. And if you are a high water use account, if you have a high water use account, or particularly if you have a larger lot, this is going to affect you obviously proportionally higher. The state-specific water conservation targets went away really a couple years after they were originally made mandatory. That's the good news. The bad news is that at this point we're looking at the requirements of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA, which focuses on achieving sustainable groundwater levels over time. Sustainable groundwater management in this case means the management and use of groundwater in a manner that can be maintained without causing undesirable results. The entire Madera subbasin and each GSA within the subbasin must be sustainable by 2040. As the council will recall, you wearing another hat, you're also the board of directors for the city's GSA. So this is a slide that was presented in a subbasin meeting just a couple of days ago, last week. This illustrates the relationship between the groundwater extraction averages in Madera over a multi-year period as a comparison to the recharge amount during that same period. And this uses 2015 land use, which is more important on the ag side probably than it is for the city, but it reflects a particular snapshot. The takeaway here is that the city's measurement shows that we're about 3,300 acre feet below a level of sustainability, or 3,300 acre feet of overdraft occurs. The point here is that the need to reduce water consumption and increase recharge is only going to grow in the future. The water conservation program is just one tool that helps in doing that. So again, what you'd want to know here is that regardless of what you're looking at with the rates or the conservation program in general, we need to keep our foot on the gas in terms of working with the community to use less water. It's not going to get easier for the city to meet sustainability requirements. It's going to get harder over time. The water conservation revenues themselves, this presents a period of 4 years since the inception of the program. You can see that during the first years of the program, we took in about $611,000. That number has increased to just a little under $900,000. Now keep in mind the original target or the original budget was about $1 million. So the fact that for the last actual year, which is fiscal year 17-18, and the projected numbers for the current year are a little less than $900,000, which means we're taking in less revenue, we're using less tier 2 and 3 water than we had anticipated in general. The cumulative revenues show that during the 4-year period that will end at the end of the current fiscal year, the total revenues would be about $3.1 million. On the expenditure side, we've got it's kind of a subdivision between program expenses and project expenses. Program expenses include the water conservation rebate program, which again started low, $24,000, and increased in actual expenses in fiscal year 17-18 to a little over $110,000. The real spike in activity occurred when we increased the amount of the rebates last year. We saw a lot of usage, particularly on the turf side. We've got a similar amount budgeted for 18-19, and our hope is that we obviously need to bust that number and issue more rebates, at which time we'd come back and ask you for
David,
appropriation there.
I'm sorry. Which year was when the school district utilized that? Was that 17-18?
That would show up as the last line item in project expenses. It's at the bottom of the sheet.
Also, it wasn't
Large
part.
landscape grant, MUSD, that's $100,000 in the current fiscal year.
It wasn't the rebates, and it was on the end. Okay, good. Thank you.
So program expenses include things like education, water patrol, meter inspection and troubleshooting. That's the kind of thing that happens when somebody has a question about, where's my meter? People have that question. Where's my meter? I don't think it's reading correctly. Can you check it? Something seems to be goofy. So we'll actually go out and inspect the meter, make sure it's working correctly. Occasionally they have to be reprogrammed. That's not the cost of somebody going out and physically installing meters in conjunction with the meter installation program. It also includes miscellaneous parks water conservation costs, which has been budgeted at $60,000 a year. The parks conservation cost includes generally the cost of parks maintenance crews spending the time necessary at the city's parks and public landscaping to make sure that we are taking care of the miscellaneous broken sprinklers and irrigation timers that go awry and those kinds of things. Because we have such a large amount of irrigated open space, that can get ahead of us in terms of water loss pretty quickly if we don't have the staff and time to deal with it. So that's what that cost goes for. One note here is, let me open that slide. Yes,
Sorry,
Councilman Oliver.
I thought you were going to the next slide, but I wanted to ask real quickly on the percolation basin improvements. Do we have an idea as to the amount of water acre feet, whether it be on one particular recharge basin or in total, how much, water is being,
I don't think that we do, but I'll look over to John and see if that's data that he has. John, do we have that? Yeah. So that isn't data that we have. We could check into it and see if that's been quantified or not, but I don't know the answer here this evening.
I'd like that follow-up information if we have it. I think that'd be.
Very good. That's something we'll check into. John, if you could make a note, and we'll make sure we get it. The green box here is meant to highlight the fact that in fiscal year 18-19, we specifically set up the accounting mechanism in the form of a separate org code to track and display conservation program revenues and expenses as a single entity. Prior to that, the revenues and expenses were tracked out of the water fund, out of the water quality division, and so forth. And it made it more difficult for folks to understand how many dollars were coming in on the revenue side and where they were going. And so we rectified that by setting up that accounting mechanism. It does make it a bit difficult if you're trying to compare the previous years to the current year, and that's why I've taken the time to explain it. In terms of project expenses, those are the CIP kind of expenses that we're seeing as alternative or optional expenses. So we have a couple of significant median island landscaping projects. Those are the heavy drought tolerant projects that went in starting in fiscal year 15-16. The 4th Street median island project was about, I think, $117,000 roughly, and Pine and Pecan is about $170,000. And after that, the percolation basin improvements, where we go in and drill wells, essentially wet wells, into basins to assist with recharge. We've done multiple basins. I think those are roughly, John, about $25,000 a hit. Is that about ballpark? Yeah, so that reflects multiple basins in each year, 16, 17, and 17, 18. And then obviously the large landscape grant, Mid-Area Unified Project at $100,000 in the current year. So when you look at revenues, expenses, and available dollars kind of all rolled up, you get the picture that was provided in your staff report. What that shows is the far right-hand column, and you look at about $3.1 million in total revenues projected to be received by year end this year, and about $1.8 million of expenses projected by the end of this year. That also means that there's about $1.2 million, almost $1.3 million in available resources in the Water Conservation Fund available for water conservation projects the council would deem appropriate. So what might those potential projects be? Projects that were discussed beginning in really 15-16 when we developed the mechanism to generate revenue for water conservation. The first couple of items were probably a little bit higher on the list, but they were more expensive items. Smart irrigation controller conversions on city facilities. This is what we view as being sort of low-hanging fruit. It's expensive low-hanging fruit, but it's something that we know can increase efficiencies and reduce water wasting simply by installing these smart controllers. I think we totaled that out as fully loaded and developed it's close to $1 million project to put smart irrigation controllers across city facilities. And then a couple drought tolerant demonstration projects and a design garden, and then drought tolerant landscaping conversion on existing city landscaping. That could include all types of public landscaping from City Hall to park strips to even LMDs. Again, a percolation basin connections to the Mid-Area Irrigation District Canal. This is something that we're trying to do as much as we can. This is less about purely reducing how much water we use and more about reducing the impact of our usage on the underlying aquifer. Leak detection in the city's infrastructure system, its water system. Looking at gray water system installation in new development. So an example of that is we offer rebates for for individual folks that want to install gray water systems, and that has been very infrequently used. Are we above zero yet, John? Do you remember? Yeah, I think we're yet to see folks that are truly interested in gray water. What we talked about doing conceptually as part of this bigger program was funding through the development community the installation of house system gray water to make it less of a burden and more of an incentive for a developer to just add these systems to their designs. And it would have to be, it's just foreign enough for people, including the folks that are building the units, that it would really need to be incentivized to be used. Additional wet well improvements in basins to enhance recharge, that's something that we're already doing. This would be just more of it. And finally, water meter installations and replacement. There are plenty of old meters that are just not reading correctly. It's not incentivizing people to use less water when their meter is reading slowly, let's just say.
And Dave, when you say installation, are you talking about retail? Are you talking about residential or multifamily, or where have we not installed meters yet?
I think the primary thing that we're thinking about is probably on the commercial side. But we to be honest with you, every time we do an audit of the flat rate accounts, we come up with more flat rate accounts than we thought we had previously. So we're constantly trying to get that managed and incorporated into ongoing projects so that we can be completely free of these flat rate accounts that are just seemingly appearing out of our utility billing system. But we do have still, I would say, in the hundreds of flat rate accounts at a minimum.
And that was my question. How many of those flat rate accounts do you have? And are those primarily your commercial accounts?
I'm not prepared to classify where the accounts lie. I do know that in trying to find that information recently, we came up with a list of at least several hundred, might be a couple thousand units. I tend to think that some of those are probably complexes of some sort where individual accounts in a complex were all sent out at a flat rate. But regardless, we're still coming up with higher numbers than we have seen before, and that's obviously needs to be a priority for the city, whether it's conservation dollars or its capital program, because we're just disincentivizing the consistent application of volumetric rates whenever folks are left on the old flat rate system.
And our median islands aren't metered, correct?
That is probably accurate.
I think that's part of some of the conversions we had possibly talked about before on metering our own landscape medians and having smart meters, detection and things of that nature. That's part of this, is that right? And going back to the gray water, Dave, we really don't have anything spelled out. I mean, if we were just to kind of do the off-the-cuff ask, there's not a lot of interest there, but we really don't have anything at the city that's spelled out on what that incentive would look like, whether it's a small development, it's a large residential development, or something commercial, on what that incentive would be. And so what you're saying here is, as a potential project, could we potentially go forward with that, map that out, and conservation on the front end, some sort of rebate or incentive for the developer on the back end?
And that's the point. We have offered it on a one-on-one basis and not seen any real interest in individual ratepayers implementing gray water systems. And I don't know whether we would be successful if we went to a builder let's say on a subdivision basis and said, would you consider if we wrote down your building permit fees or your development impact fees for water, for instance, in a significant amount, maybe that would be $5,000. I don't know, enough to cover the cost of a gray water system, or most of the cost of a gray water system. The dilemma that we have with that kind of a program and why it's not kind of leading edge is that we will never save, I shouldn't say never, we will rarely save as much water from the implementation of a gray water system as we will from a turf replacement system, because the bulk of water usage in most accounts still occurs outside. And so to implement a really useful system-wide gray water system is quite expensive, but you might, probably are going to have a harder time recovering that cost than if you were to provide 1 or 2 turf replacements, for instance, for the same amount of money. The difference is if we're looking to the long view under Sigma and saying at some point we're going to have to be sustainable, particularly as the city grows, because none of the other GSAs in the Madera Subbasin have a situation like the city. We will grow, and as the city's GSA grows, other GSAs shrink. So it's effectively a zero-sum game. We can't grow without somebody else losing, so their problem gets a little different, ours gets a little different, but we will need to save more over time to make room for new development, is what I'm thinking is going to be the
Councilwoman Gallegos.
Dave, I had a question about your water meter installation replacements. Are we using conservation dollars to replace those water meters right now?
No.
And are the meters have warranty on them, and how long do they last?
The typical lifespan for the census meters that we're installing are roughly characterized as having a 10-year useful life. I think their warranty is probably a year. John, is that, or Ellen?
Yeah, I can stretch the warranty on it a year.
Yeah. So we're talking about a warranty. I'm sorry, it's not on the record. What the staff in the back is saying is that the warranties are effectively a year, and the useful life is, let's say for the sake of discussion, a 10-year useful life. That's the projections that we're working on.
So do we have a plan for, in the city, when water meters get to that lifespan where we are changing them out?
Yes and no. So in the CIP that is included in the financial plan that's in front of you, there is a discrete element of the capital needs list that covers meter replacements. In terms of how to deal with that programmatically, I think we're still looking for best practice, because we don't think we want to go in and start randomly saying, well, this neighborhood has reached its 10-year useful life, so we're going to go and comprehensively take those meters out of service. But we don't also want to wait until we know that they failed before we go in and start replacing them. So I think we're still looking for best practice to actually make the meter change outs, but the dollars are included in the rate program, the rate financial plan that's in front of you.
Okay, so if we're putting this on this list for conservation dollars, how are we paying for it now for installation and replacement? Through the CIPs?
I think we still have not completely exhausted the bond proceeds that were originally intended for that purpose. And then after that, it's just CIP rate dollars, correct?
And, if I may.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Yes. So to that question, from those projects that you listed there, in the past, have any of those projects been utilized through that CIP fund? You said that currently you're using bond monies, and essentially then you'll run into the CIP. Now I see that we have about $1.2 million in these conservation funds, but are those projects ideally conservation, or are they more your CIP?
I'm not sure I can take another shot at that question. I'm not
Well,
sure I understand you.
I'm looking at the list of projects that you have, and the question that Councilwoman Gallegos had posed is, how are you putting these meters now? Are you utilizing capital improvement funds, or are you utilizing these conservation funds? Is it a mix of both, or that's the question that I'm asking?
So the dollars that are the projects that have been constructed to date, that are shown here were funded using just the conservation dollars. If you're asking, could they have been funded using a combination of conservation and non-conservation dollars out of the rates? The answer is well, I think yes in some cases and probably not in others. So for instance, we typically wouldn't have funded a landscaping project with water fund dollars. The only reason we did so in this case is to demonstrate a specific change in protocol from, let's call it old style traditional landscaping to drought tolerant landscaping. By comparison, looking at something like percolation basin improvements, that's something more typical that we might have funded out of the water fund in order to enhance the recharge component of those basins. Or we might have funded potentially out of storm drainage funds as well. Those are harder to come by.
So regardless of the projects and where the monies are coming from, it's still coming from the same, I mean, it still affects the rate the same way, right? Because at the end of the day, I mean, you build these rates based on these projects or projected projects, and nevertheless, you have to account for that in some way or shape or form where the rate is set based on those projects that we're doing.
Yeah, that's true where the projects would be built anyway, but it's less true, or it's less the case when we consider that we're only building projects because we have the opportunity to spend conservation dollars to reduce consumption. And so I think there's a combination of those projects. As I mentioned, I think we only built the drought tolerant median island landscaping because we had the conservation funding to do so. So those projects wouldn't have been funded from some other source, at least not at that cost. So it's about prioritization. With only so much ability to construct projects, staff and the council are always prioritizing what they want to build, what's the most important, what has the most need in accordance with timelines that exist. So I think you're on the right track that whether it's a CIP project or a conservation project, they both have an effect on the rates, but there isn't necessarily the situation where the projects are interchangeable from one source or another.
On that note, Dave, just to clarify, these conservation dollars, these particular ones that we're talking about, is Tier 2 and Tier 3 dollars?
Tier 2 and Tier 3 of the single-family rate, a little bit of Tier 2 of the multifamily rate, and a little bit of the non-commercial rate. And Habib and/or Tim can maybe provide some substance to background to that.
We'll get to it. You had mentioned that at the very beginning, so I just want to make sure that what the dollars we're talking about here is not just single pot, that is from a
Correct.
portion of Tier 2. And then, so for instance, maintenance and repair, and to be more specific, the maintenance and repair we did on Schnorr, which was a seven-figure, $1.2 million fix, where did those dollars come from?
Any dollars that are spent on repair and replacement or program CAP projects come out of either the general capital schedule and that's included in the rates, so there's rate revenue in there, and then obviously some projects draw on other funding sources like development impact fees or they have street components to them, or CDBG funding or the like. So I think we can have some alphabet soup for different projects, but typically relative to sewer and water, there's large elements of rate revenue.
I just bring that up so that when we discuss those different alphabets, if you will, the impacts it has to our community. Councilwoman Gallegos.
Since we're on the slide again, Dave, question on the landscaping grant for Medina Unified School District. Have we already given them the $100,000 for that grant program?
I don't think we've given them. Let me check with John. Yeah,
No.
the agreement was executed, but that was based on a reimbursement program, and so they're in the process still.
Do we have a performance measures for them when it's going to happen, or?
John, why don't you come up and address that?
Thanks for calling him up. I was going to get in trouble if he spoke from the back row again.
I know, I was getting the look. Yes, I currently have a letter from a landscape architect that has met with the school district. They have specified equipment. I spoke with Mary Ann today. We're hoping to get together tomorrow or Thursday. We want to review the letter, review the equipment that they are requesting to use, and after that, we give them our blessing and they'll move forward. The grant, I believe, is supposed to sunset in, I think, the end of April, first part of May. And the last conversation I had with them, they felt pretty confident that they could perform within that time frame.
I'm sorry.
And real quickly, John, so they've already awarded that contract? 'Cause I know they're doing the entire procurement for the architect, or is it a,
I would assume that they have awarded a contract to a designer who is going to put the project together, package it all up.
Okay,
And
then
then, most likely, there would be another contract that would be issued to somebody who's gonna actually do the installation. But I met with Curtis from the school district, and there's one thing that I can share with you that I thought was kind of interesting was, he did indicate that there were certain components of the grant and the installation that they were gonna try to do in-house. So I believe that there's probably a combination of different things that are gonna occur.
and I think during that discussion item too, they'd mentioned that within their educational procurement code, they may have a little bit more flexibility in terms of hiring local, businesses to supply the parts or, so maybe where we can in conversations to see that, that's still being encouraged and that's seen as a priority.
Absolutely.
Mayor Pro Tem Rodriguez.
Yes, thank you, Member Dillon. So I was gonna just write on Mayor's question regarding the Tier 2 and Tier 3 rates. And he asked the question if the conservation account was primarily the Tier 2 and Tier 3. So that being said, obviously those tiers hit heavily most on the single-family residents, I'm assuming, right? And do we have certain, amounts of what that is as far as, you had mentioned also that there was about hundreds of flat rate users still, and could be in the thousands of units. So none of these other units and/or flat rate users are being hit with these 2 and 3 tier. So do we have an amount more or less of what that is? Is it mainly your residential units, single family or commercial or what have you?
Tim, do you have that data in terms of the revenue generation? How much is received by each customer class? Not with us. I think that's something that we can probably tease out of the system. Our current utility billing system doesn't automatically generate that information, and so we've had to manually go in and calculate how much is in each, how much Tier 2 and Tier 3 revenue is being received. But I think we could probably identify at least the difference between the single-family Tier 2 and Tier 3 versus the other rates.
Okay. And only because, that brought up an interesting point is, are the ratepayers paying more than their share, if any, because of not having the other entities on a Tier 2, Tier 3, but rather on a flat rate, and that's kind of what posed my question there. But you brought up an interesting point there. Those are their Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 3 rates, and I just want to make sure how those are allocated and what we see.
Yeah, I think the way that the rates are calculated, and again, Habib may answer this differently. Each you know, the cost of providing services for each customer class and for each type of service that's included in the rates is calculated on its own merit, if you will. And so when the rates are applied and a user pay those rates when they use water, they're paying their cost. When somebody is not paying according to a volumetric rate, they may not be paying their cost, but their burden isn't being shifted to somebody else. It just means that they're probably getting a better deal than average up until they're converted to that metered rate. So that's why there's no question in my view that we need to get all of those older flat rates converted to metered, and it needs to be a priority.
Absolutely. That's a very good point, Mayor Pro Tem. It's about being fair and equitable for everybody. And I know when we first started doing meters, there were some hurdles to jump through. Multifamily was one of them. How do we separate each individual door, for instance? It's just impossible to have, we would only have one meter. And gated communities was another issue, getting into their property. But I think we've overcome most of that, and now we're in a position to kind of clean that up. And so, to Mayor Pro Tem's point, in order to be fair and equitable, to spread that cost amongst everybody, we need to dive into that sooner rather than later and find out who is still on those flat rates and why. Yeah, good point.
So in terms of program alternatives, this is sort of heading towards the conclusion of this part of the program. Regardless of any specific actions that the council might take, it's staff's recommendation that we retain a focus on using less water in the community. Again, that's going to be harder to do over time, and so it's not a good time to conceptually take our foot off the gas in terms of delivering that message. Regardless of what we do or you do as the council with rates, our message in the community that the water is precious and we need to conserve is something that we need to stay consistent on. The water conservation budget itself can really be set at any level that's desired by the council. So conceptually, you can leave it as it is and just talk to us about the kinds of projects that you have an interest in building. Or you can reduce the budget at some lower rate and provide direction on the funding priorities that you have. And so conceptually, you could say, we'd rather see it something like 50% of what it is, or 25%, or 75%, but our highest priority is maintaining those rebates or maintaining water patrol or what have you. Our assumption is that those are the kind of bread and butter expenses of water conservation, and it's the project side that would ultimately be reduced up and down to the extent funding is available. But that's certainly up to you as your body decides where to take the program. And so this evening, the council can provide specific direction on any elements that you're prepared to do so, or you can direct staff to provide a follow-up on any item of interest. And we do understand that the items are complex and they're intertied, and you may have some questions about, if we did this, what would the effect on that be? And I think we can work through probably a lot of those questions this evening between Tim and Habib on the financial side. But if there's anything that we can't answer for you, we'll just make sure we understand the question. We'll bring it back so that you get the information you're looking for. And so that really sort of wraps up the water conservation discussion from my perspective. And then Habib is going to present the financial plan element of tonight's meeting. But I want to pause here and ask if there's any additional questions, or if you have any what-if questions that you want to talk about, just about the water conservation, before we talk about the bigger financial plan.
Mayor Pro Tem, sure.
Yes, I have a what-if here for you, David. So, what if the water consumption is either sets at this year's level or decreases at some point? The water conservation account is still increasing based on the rates that were factored in. Is that still going to continue to grow, or is that based on the consumption? I mean, we're utilizing this conservation account for programs and what have you, rebates, but assuming that the water does, somehow residents become to behave a bit better with their water consumption, and we don't exceed a certain amount, or we decrease that. What does that look like for us in the future as far as water conservation? Does that mean that rates come down? I mean, because obviously the cost of everything continues to increase. So obviously you have to factor that into the rates moving forward. Or what does that look like? I mean,
Right, so the water conservation component of the rates is static and designed to create a total revenue need or total budget of $1 million. Now, as we explained, the actual revenue generated, because we're using less water than we had anticipated, is somewhat less than the $1 million target. And again, that amount is static, so it wasn't set up to generate $1 million the first year, and then $1.2 million, and then $1.3 million, and then $1.6 million. That component stays the same over time, and you'll see that in the water conservation accounting mechanism, the ORC code going forward. If particularly the outdoor irrigation in the community reduces over time, is lowered over time, there'll be less Tier 2 and Tier 3 rates being paid, and so the conservation funding will go down. The revenue received will go down in the program. It's the amount of revenue received is directly tied to how much we receive in Tier 2 and Tier 3 rate revenue.
but the programs that are needed, such as the ones described here, doesn't that create or factor in for that conservation account to increase as well, or?
It doesn't. So this is a fairly unique component of the rates where the revenue need was set at a level that the council said, this is what we want to be able to spend on a pool of water conservation programs. And then we spend, that generates an amount of revenue, and that revenue gets spent on any eligible program. And that differs from the rest of the rates, where you're essentially building your cost, you're building your operational cost, you're building your CIP, you're building your debt ratio, debt coverage ratios, your reserve requirements, and then you're saying, okay, in order to meet all of those needs, we've got to generate this much money and set our rates to do that. So this discrete element sort of works backwards, if you will. Yeah.
Okay.
Habib, would you describe that differently? Habib, for the record, says that's about right.
And I think too, in terms of the amount set for the conservation program, we also looked at various cities as well and seeing how quickly they're burning through conservation dollars for similar incentives and rebates and things of that sort. And at least that's what I recall from those discussions and reading through the meeting minutes.
You're right. Right.
Yeah, I think we were particularly not focused, at least aware of the demand on turf replacement. And I thought, I think we were initially surprised that there wasn't more interest in that initially. And like I said, it's grown fairly substantially as the numbers have gone up in terms of allowable rebates. But it's, if the idea was that we would spend, all of the money on turf replacements, we're not, probably not going to get there unless we were to really increase the amount of the rebates, which people are, human beings are human beings. If you make it lucrative enough, people will follow the money. So you never know.
I think our outreach in the beginning was not as aggressive as it could have been. I think we knew, and a small circle knew, that there were rebates out there. We just didn't use whatever means necessary to really get that out there to the community, that there's rebates available. And then maybe our approach in that a licensed contractor had to do certain work. And so when it came to low flow toilets or shower heads, I'm not sure if that was just show me a receipt and we'll pay you money. But when it came to sprinkler heads and turf replacement, we may have made it a little maybe a little too difficult for them meaning the community, to take advantage of that. So, again, discussions we can have, there's dollars there, we would like the community to take advantage of it. So we'll continue to discuss that, but we need to obviously be efficient in the way we do things, but at the same time, maybe look at the way we do things.
And I'll finish off by asking, with the cumulative dollar projected by the end of this fiscal year, I mean, obviously, one of the questions that you'll pose to this council is what we can do with that money? Is that something, here's another what-if scenario. What if you threw it back into the rates and decreased that? That's obviously a valid question, but how would that look, and how would that affect the city in its efforts of conserving?
Yeah, I think Habib might be able to answer that, but maybe my suggestion is, if there's an interest on the part of the council in reducing the size and scale of the conservation program, rather than trying to retroactively blend back in conservation dollars to the rest, I think what you'd effectively do is set the conservation program amount, your revenue needs for that program, at the level that you feel comfortable doing, and then just spending the pool of conservation dollars in place on those programs. So let's say that this rate is going to carry us through for another couple of years. If you're comfortable that you want, this is hypothetically speaking, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but let's just say that you wanted to spend about $500,000 a year for the next couple of years under the current 5-year rate study. You've got $1.2 million to do that. You could cut the conservation rate prospectively down to 0, and then spend, the money in the bank over the next 2 years for the conservation program. I think you could do that. That's much, I think, more easily accomplished than trying to figure out how to blend one kind of dollar into another kind of dollar and affect the overall rate structure. But Habib is our expert. That's why he's here. He could probably answer that.
Councilwoman Gallegos.
Dave, you were talking hypothetically, a zero balance in those dollars for conservation, but doesn't the state require us to have a certain percentage for conservation? No, none? Okay.
We've covered quite a bit so far, and we've had a lot of discussion. I'll just ask if there's anybody in the audience at this time. It won't be the only or last time, but if there's anybody in the audience that wants to come ask any questions of staff or council. If not, maybe after we do Mr. Isaac, we can also open it up as well. At this time, I think we'll have Habib Isaac from Raftellus give us his portion of the workshop.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, council members. Habib Isaac with Raftellus. And I just want to point out a couple things, kind of jump on Dave's coattails on the conservation. One question was Councilmember Rodriguez was, what was the total amount of those tier 2, tier 3? So essentially, your single family is your biggest customer class, regardless of what the rates are. They're around 72% of your total usage. So most of the revenue of any component, whether it be the flat meter charge, the tier 1 rate, most of the revenue is going to be coming from single family because it makes up so much of your customer base. But 72% of all usage is single family. But then if I get rid of tier 1 and just look at those tiers and usage that are impacted by conservation, single family is 62% of the usage. And mainly because they've been reducing their tier 2 and tier 3 usage over time. Okay. Another question was, what if we see conservation and those revenues go down? I would say that, granted the revenues will go down, but then your projects have been successful, and then you don't need your program to be as extensive as it is today, because there's a finite amount of return on your dollars that you get. You can't replace something that's already been replaced. Like turf replacements, it's done, then that's now gone, not on the table anymore. So then you don't need to spend $1 million every year. So I would see that as a benefit, that if you see usage go down, then you're being successful and your conservation program is successful. But with that, let me open up my PowerPoint, and then I also plan on opening up the model and give you a couple scenarios that I looked at, things that I see, and then also open to any scenario that you may come to mind as I go through this PowerPoint or through my scenarios. Some things might come to mind and want me to model. I could do that. So I was here, earlier this year, and the purpose of at that point in time was me just to discuss what was done 4 years ago and why. And I summarized everything. So I'm going to summarize that one more time to refresh your memories, and then go into what does it look like today, and how are we doing compared to what was projected, and then what does it look like moving forward, and what are some options we could do to mitigate rates in the future. Because ultimately, that's the sense that I got. So that's why I have set up for you.
Before you get started, if you see me walk out, it's not because of you.
No problem. Understood. I think you're here till around 7 o'clock. Is that correct? I'll do my best. Okay, so back in 14-15, unfortunately, the utility enterprise fund, the water fund, was in a pretty dire situation. And the enterprise fund should be self-funding. It should be viewed as its own separate business. It should function on its own. It shouldn't need any other dollars, just recover its costs based on the rate revenue. So you had negative cash flow, which means you were using other funds to cover the day-to-day expenses. You were not meeting your debt coverage, so you're actually in technical defaults of your existing bonds, and you had bond covenants that said we will have X amount of dollars above our debt payment to ensure our equity in the game. And then also, because of all that, you also didn't have enough funding for repair and replacement. So you were basically deferring projects. And essentially, you had to catch up in at least recovering the cost to cover the way your assets depreciate. So you have upcoming repair and replacements. So there's quite a things that need to be done. Plus, you want to have a certain amount of reserves in place for any type of emergencies that occur, and just for cash flow purposes on your day-to-day basis. So this was what your financial plan looked like earlier. This is just operating. This does not include any capital. The bars represent your cost, with blue being operating, purple being your debt obligations, and the black trend line going across was your current rates back then, just staying flat, not doing any type of rate increase. So clearly, this red shows that you're generating a negative balance that you have to overcome from other means. Then, in terms of doing no adjustments, this green trend line is showing what is your bond coverage, and what your bond coverage requirement was 120%. So you're actually in technical default, and that was probably the very first thing that we had to solve right away. Is you don't want to be technical default. You want to show the bondholders that purchase your bonds that you are going to do what's needed to ensure that you're making your debt payments. And then lastly, we also showed your capital improvement plan. It was pretty modest in the first couple of years, but we also looked out on the horizon to see what is coming up. And what was coming up was some improvements, big improvements for your storage facilities, which now is getting even closer where we are today. But it was a pretty significant amount of repair and replacement. So besides just covering your current costs, we also want to build up reserves over in these early years. So then that big expense later on is going to be so significant that it's going to cause a rate shock to your customers. We want to make sure we have a decent amount of adjustments back then to build up revenues to cover that. And then this was basically your fund balance, if you will. You had a very small amount of reserves, about 5.4 million, but with nothing, if you do nothing, you would see that you have to cover that operation shortfall. You're still funding your capital expense. You're basically it's a dire situation. So this is what we had to solve. And when we did that, we presented to the council two options: just level adjustments each year, which I forgot what that was. I think it was like 15% every single year for the next 5 years, or maybe a little bit more, or step down adjustments, which was let's do a big adjustment to get out technical default, and then let's build up to make sure that we have reserves built up. We're covering that capital expense that's going to come forward, and then we are going to slowly step down. Where at the end of the 5th year, we're now to 3%, where it's just CPI, if you would. That's what council went with. So the new financial plan outlook, debt coverage met in the first year, positive operating net income in each fiscal year moving forward, reserves built up over the next 5 years to meet minimum requirements, and then capital is funded through a combination of debt and pay-as-you-go. So we were assuming that there will be debt. The debt amount proposed was $24 million to cover that big expense, and the reason why we would be using debt is to level out, make sure we could smooth out rates for those adjustments. If we didn't have that debt plugged in, those 30 and 20 and 10% would be even more. And then in addition to that, we wanted to ensure intergenerational equity. When you have those type of capital improvements of a storage facility, the new lifespan is going to be 30, 40 years, maybe even more based on how well you do repair and replacement. You don't want your ratepayers of today to pay that full load. And issuing debt kind of goes in line with who's going to be here to benefit from that. Because you're going to have turnover. You have people that sell their homes, tenants move in, move out. So it keeps that in line as well. So in terms of revenue requirements, this was the revenue requirements needed over that time period. And you'll notice by 2020, you were basically almost doubling your revenue needs over that time period. So this is pretty significant. I mean, this was pretty critical times back then where you were. So now where are you today? And that's one thing I did from when the last time presented earlier in the calendar year to now. I got all the updated budget information, updated consumption data of how your customers are using water, plug that into a new model to see where you are today. So the best way to look at this is where are your reserves today, because we're almost at the end of that 5-year period. So the goal was to meet your reserves. Your minimum reserve target was 8.8 million. And what that included was 90 days of operating, and also included your annual average capital expense. Because ideally, some of the best management practices is operating reserves should be based on the frequency of billing. If you're monthly, you should have at least 90 days or 3 months. If you're bi-monthly, then you should have at least 6 months. If you put on the tax bill, like some sewer agencies do, then you should have at least almost up to a year, because you only get 2 installments. And then capital, you want to have at least a year's worth of capital expense. 1, so you're not stopping projects waiting for revenue to come in during that year. And 2, a lot of times you're rewarding contracts before you even start. So you want to show that you have those funds available to award that contract. And the average annual capital expense was around $6.5 million. It was quite a bit. But the reason being was because of the storage facilities that were going to come online. So I have one option to consider at the end of this. So your ideal target is 10.7 million, and the only difference there is 180 days of operating instead of 60 days. So kind of give a bandwidth of where you want to be. Because even if you go over a little bit of your minimum, that doesn't mean now you have to refund all your customers. It just means you're doing well, maybe get some deferred maintenance in, and you could do those type of projects. Actual cash balance, you're 11.9. So you're actually a little bit over your ideal target. So why is that? So a couple of reasons. One, some of the planned capital projects that have been appropriated, the money hasn't been spent yet, but will be spent. So that's more just a timing issue. And then 2, which was discussed earlier, your conservation funding, you haven't spent all those funds. So that's in your reserves right now. And you have around 1.2 million that's projected for the end of the year. So there is some potential opportunities to give some relief on what the rate schedule was for this 5 years. So here's the updated financial position with all your information, and also me looking out for all the way through 2028. We have your the orange trend line is your proposed rates, your current rates where they are, and what's planned, and then the gray trend line is also what I recommend moving forward. Granted, you still have to do a full cost of service study, because one thing with Prop 218, you always have to do it every 5 years. So that's good and bad. 1, it looks like you're always increasing rates, but 2, also makes you have to go through this full cost of service analysis to be transparent to your customers, to show the dollars, the cost, and how the rates are set. So from that standpoint, it's also a positive that it shows you're always coming forward with the plan. So keep in mind, now you have positive net income above your expenses. Notice that this purple bar, the bandwidth increases, and that's because of that bond issue that's proposed. It's already assuming that your debt payment is going to increase. with the new debt, but you still have positive net income above operating that could go to your capital and to fund reserves. Another thing, for outside of your current term, which is from 22 to 26, I'm assuming 5% adjustments for these later years. But what that shows is now, because the difficult decisions you made earlier of the 30%, you don't want to get back in that situation. Now you're looking at single digit adjustments, maybe with cost savings, other things, that maybe the 5% could be more just CPI 3%. This is something you can look at every year, but this is more where you want to be in terms of moving forward looking. You want to be, single digit revenue adjustments and just keeping up with inflation ideally. So capital funding, here's your updated project cost. That was updated by the city. You still have your facilities. And then what this green bar shows is that this is being funded through debt proceeds. The orange is funded through pay-as-you-go, funds available, and rate revenue. Okay?
We're fine.
I'm sorry,
We're
Habib,
fine.
there's Mayor Pro Tem has a question. Are
I'll
you
let him
good?
finish.
Okay, please continue.
Okay, no problem. And then now here's your reserves. So remember, before your reserves were negative, it was very dire. Now your reserves are trending right within your minimum target and your ideal target. Don't worry about this big jump. That's just the proceeds coming into your coffers to use, and you use it right away for your capital improvements. So that's just your from issuing the bonds, and you get the proceeds right away. So reserves are within the requirements and the target. So a couple options. One is reduce. One thing that I noticed that, now that you think about it, we can actually reduce the capital reserve target, where we could exclude the storage facilities, because that's a one-time expense that's not typical. You're not going to replace your storage facility every year. You're going to do it probably every 10, 20, 30 years. So if we took out that storage facility to not impact the average, then you could reduce your reserve target from 6.8 million to 4 million. So do you really need your fund balance, your reserves, to be that high? Maybe probably not, based on what your typical expenses are. And going back to here, you'll notice that now it comes down, and this is probably what's more typical for your typical repair and replacement needs for your system. So that's one option. That's going to allow you to potentially mitigate rates or reduce some portion of the rates, and to see where are you in that bandwidth between the minimum target and the ideal. And then second is, you may reduce the conservation component as funds are still available. There's still 1.2 million, and to what extent can you do that? So if you wouldn't mind, I would then open up the model and show you some of these examples, unless you want to ask me some questions before I go into that part of my presentation.
Thank you for that. Any questions at this point?
Yes,
Pro Tem.
Habib, I had one question regarding the slide where you showed the actuals. And what I had asked before, when you presented earlier this year, was the cost of not moving on those capital improvement projects. So I understand that we have, it looks like our actual balance is higher because those capital improvements haven't been executed yet. So, I mean, my concern is always what additional costs we or the people are paying for when we're not moving on these capital improvement projects. And I know it's a time issue, but again, the cost of construction, building, what have you, always increase, especially now. I mean, it looks like building has gone up quite a bit. So do we factor that in?
Yeah.
Is that factored in moving forward?
Yeah, so the sub-bullet under the last main bullet of certain plan capital projects are still in progress, that's really just timing from fiscal to fiscal year. It's a carryover. It's a carryover where the project's just not done yet, but it's being constructed. It just didn't finish in that fiscal year. So that project's still moving forward. It's still going to be spent. It's just that I don't want to give you a false positive that you have more reserves than we actually will, when they're already almost appropriated for that project still.
And the reason why I ask is because prior to your study in, was it 14, or back when they initiated this study, you know, you had kicked the can down the road so far. And
Absolutely.
deferred maintenance and deferred these improvements, that's where you get where you're at now. So my concern is, are we doing similar things by not executing these capital improvement projects and essentially paying for the cost later on?
Understood, Councilmember Rodriguez. So that's going to be where this comes in. Here's your updated capital improvements. So the question would be to staff of from 2022 through 2028. You know, there's a spike here of maybe about $5 million. Is this keeping up with the depreciation of the assets and in line with, or are we still need to catch up on deferred maintenance? And I believe that based on all the things that have been done since our last study, you're now getting in line with keeping up with depreciation. But I'll have to defer with either Tim or Dave Merchant on that.
Thank you, Habib.
Councilman Oliver.
Before we move forward, I wanted to ask two clarifying questions. One, kind of revisits very early discussions when we went through this process in terms of the legality of the tiered system. And I know that San Juan Capistrano and the litigation that surrounded that city and their tiered structure comes to mind. I know that your firm has had a relationship with that city as well. Can you provide some additional frame
Sure.
of reference in terms
Yes.
of the legality and
Absolutely. So we were actually hired by San Juan to get out of the issue that occurred to make sure that their rates are in compliance. We did that. We through a course of many meetings and our analysis, we updated the rates to be cost-based. That was the main issue, is that their tiered rates were really just multipliers of the tier 1 rate, where tier 2 is like twice as much, tier 3 is 3 times as much, instead of showing the unit prices that relate to each tier.
proportionality and
The proportionality, we updated that, and I just want to point out that San Juan Capistrano still has tiered rates. It is that now they're in compliance, and even the entity that was suing the city stood up and said that our rate structure and our report is in compliance with Prop 218, and they concurred that now the tier rates are in line. So I just want to point out that tier rates are legal. It's just that you have to make sure you show the nexus and the cost associated with each tier.
absolutely, and obviously we have to be cognizant, aware if there's any exposure to litigation, and which I know our legal staff weighed in on, and you provided some comfort and knowledge back then. But with some of the cities that you've worked with, have any been challenged and have had to revert back to a previous rate structure because of that legal challenge?
You know, in recent times, there's a lot of agencies being challenged on a number of items. I remember Davis was challenged on, actually not doing certain capital improvements that they said they were going to do, but they had capital improvements, and on that one, they held them up, and there's a few challenges on whether tier rates are valid, and those been held up, but a lot of it has to do also with can potable water customers fund a portion of recycled water? The answer is yes on that one. That litigation was held up as well. But there's always litigation going on throughout the state, and we're always monitoring, the current court cases that are coming down the pipeline to see how it impacts our clients, and to make any type of adjustments, because it's not just the statutes and the Constitution, it's also case law that impacts what to do moving forward. We still do tiered rates. We still have many agencies do budget-based rates. That's still very popular. And then we do have few customers, when San Juan came out, went to uniform rates just to be safe, but now are switching back to tiered rates after we came in and recertified the San Juan Capistrano rates, and tier rates are still pretty prominent throughout California.
And then my last question, I know back then you factored in anticipated conservation, at that moment we were, I think, the 3rd or 4th year in just perpetual drought,
Right.
Facing pretty significant mandates from the state with financial consequences if we didn't meet them. So I believe that we factored that in, right? And now that some of those mandates have been lifted, have you noticed, a pretty significant increase in revenue because of, I think we've still maintained, pretty good conservation, and as we have over the past 2 decades. In fact, I think our consumption between 2005 and 2015, according to our water management plan, reduced in half, and that's obviously a significant decrease in revenue. But looking at our financial picture and what we factored in terms of the continued conservation requirements, what have you kind of noticed there?
Sure. So we did make an assumption that in our study that you're going to see a reduction in usage because you have tier rates, and then we weren't sure how the drought and everything was going to impact it. And I would say, based on doing this update, our plan is pretty much dead on of where you should be. And my recommendation is to follow the plan. But I am also here to show you other scenarios in case because you need to know more than just follow the plan and that's it. I need to show you what else is out there. Definitely. Also, I would say that we're probably seeing a little bit less usage than even what we anticipated because it's in the higher tiers because your conservation component isn't generating $1 million. It's generating $850. So that right there implies that the usage we had that generated $1 million is not there. And so you're actually seeing a little bit less usage in those tiers. We might end up with the same amount of total water demand, but less of that demand is in the higher tiers and more of it's in like tier 1.
Makes sense. Thank you. Thanks, Javier. We'll continue.
Okay, so with that, I'll show you some of the options I came up with. So this is now showing you the change. Let me see if you wouldn't mind. I could increase this a little bit. So right here, I did already change the reserve requirement for capital. I reduced it down based on it being like more of a $4 million instead of a $6.5 million. But this is the combination of operating and capital. So that's why you see it at right around $6 million. So with that, you'll see that now you're exceeding. So you do have opportunities if you want to be somewhere in this bandwidth to give some relief on rates. And my focus would be the relief should be on the conservation component because that's more discretionary revenues as opposed to say the 10% that is planned for this year that you haven't acted on yet. It was supposed to be implemented July 1st. So even with so a couple assumptions I need to point at you with reducing this reserve. There's a couple things here. One is I am assuming that 10% is going into effect for January, this upcoming January, because right now you haven't done anything. I have it as January, so that'd be one thing I could take away, and I could show you what happens. And then the other thing and the 3% that's planned. So right now, just a 6-month delay on what was already planned. Okay, and then and this is with the conservation component. I have it at 100%, so the full rate. And then, as I mentioned in my PowerPoint, I'm also showing that basically the anticipated adjustments in the next cost of service study that you're going to have to do at 5%. So let me start with that. Let's say these are 0, okay? So let's say future rate increases are not going to happen. Then you're doing fine for the initial few years, but then it's going to be gone, your reserves, because basically your capital is using it. You're funding this capital, and it's going to take the funds in your reserves to fund all of it. That's what's covering that shortfall. But granted, this is pretty dire. This ain't no rate increases for, 14 years.
Wow.
Okay? Another thing that would happen is you would be in technical default of your new bonds because you're going below that requirement. So let's do 3%, which is roughly, say, inflation if you tie it to CPI. So if you tie it to CPI, you're not making any decisions now, and then we still have to do a full cost service study in a year or two. If you do CPI, you're still looking pretty good. You're just below the minimum. But this portion out here would be the second study that is done, the second iteration of the study. 5 years after now. So during the time period and the next 5 years, you would see a little dip here. So that's why I put in 5%. If we do 4, we might be okay. Let's do it for the 5 years. So if you do 4 instead of 5, you're fine. But this is with, remember, you're saying okay to reducing the reserve policy based on it going down for the capital because that storage facility shouldn't affect the average. So that's where we are now. If we then say, let's reduce conservation. Let's say we reduced it by half. Whoops, that's 5%. That's where we are. So you're fine with debt coverage. You're fine for operating. Your revenue above operating cost. You have positive net income, but then it's how you fund your capital and how do you leverage your reserves. Now with a 50% cut of your conservation component, this is in the later years. You see that you dip it down, but again, you still have a full cost service study you have to do. That if you reduce it now, then these adjustments up here might have to be a little bit higher when you come to that point and you come to that study. But everything's gonna be on the table when we do that once again, or whoever does it. Then I'll show you another one. If we get rid of the next adjustment,
This is the adjustment that we've postponed.
yes. This is where you'd be. Could just delay that, don't have any adjustment for this whole year and cut conservation by 50%. I wouldn't say there would be a situation where you cut the 10% and keep the conservation at 100%. I don't think that's really an option because your conservation is you already have a fund balance of 1.2 million. It only can be used for certain projects. That isn't used to cover your reserve targets. So really, I wouldn't want to show you cut it by just do a 5% increase and keep conservation at 100%.
I think what my question would be is for the next council in 2024, what decisions would they have to make to get us back to a proper operating expense?
And I can show you that if you want. Give me what criteria do you want? 0, delay this.
We kept the conservation efforts, but we did not implement the next increase, the 10 and the 3.
But we reduce reserves.
Reserves conservation.
I think you still got the 3 in there for next year.
But no,
Yeah,
that's
I
the
do.
Yeah, we have a,
capital reserve by removing the water storage project out of that average.
Yes.
right.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor, can you repeat that again? Because I think you just mentioned the option that I recommended not to show, but I could show that one of.
No, I probably did. My apologies.
And I could show you that, but I would not recommend that one where this is 0, but then your conservation is at 100%. You keep that because that can only be
That
used
is
for.
what I said.
That can only be used for certain projects, and it can't be used to meet your minimum reserve requirements.
Exactly.
So it gives you kind of like a false impression.
I know that's what I said. My apologies, but it wasn't what I meant.
Okay.
Habib, if you don't mind, Mr. Mayor, just want to make sure those charts that you're showing, once you input the information, it's all 4 charts take in the account of what you just changed, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
meeting the debt service is also
Yes.
critical for us. So when I'm looking at that chart, I
Yes.
just want to make sure, okay.
That's correct.
Yeah, good point.
And even when you cut your conservation, you're still looking fine on your debt.
Real quickly, so there's a lot that goes into this.
Oh yes.
It's a very complicated exercise. It's, our staff is very talented. We have a lot of resources, and it goes even beyond times what our capacity is. How do other cities make this an ongoing and active dialogue where the data and the numbers and the financials are driving these decisions rather than 5 years go by?
Mhm.
Because if we didn't bring this back, I want to assume that we probably wouldn't be bringing it back and, until our next 5-year update. Or maybe at least in terms of before we're going out to bond on the water
Mhm.
storage. So what are some of the best practices you're seeing to kind of keep that an active discussion? Because I think this is something we got to do on an annual basis, given the economics of this particular fund, and the changes, whether it be in the state or Mother
Right.
Nature or capital requirements. So can you glean any insight there?
Yes, so this is a deliverable that we give to the city that you could put in the new budget numbers, and they did so. Down here is all your expenses. We have the next year available to put that in. If it's not inputted, then the previous year is escalated for future years. So all that is inputted into the model. Some agencies do it on their own, and then they just want us to do a cursory review. Other agencies want us to do what we did this year. We do it every year, and because we did the models, it's a very minimal cost. And they also, some agencies like hearing it from a third party, because I don't really have any incentive to let you make the numbers come out a certain way. I'm just telling you where it's at and where you need to be, and what my recommendations would be moving forward, just like I did now. And granted, I'm sure you don't like seeing maybe even these percentages, but again, part of it is Prop 218. If we were able to say, look, let's after the fifth year, let's make it indexed to CPI every year. You can't do that unless you started with indexing every year. So say we're at the point in the next cost service that all you're doing is indexing and not needing a higher increase. You could do that in perpetuity until the point in time that you need to do an updated cost service study because you need more revenue or you want to change the rate structure. But in one of the statutes, it requires you that at least once every 10 years, you should do a full cost of service study, regardless of your financial position.
I appreciate that, and I think it's something we should maybe factor in future budgets to have at least a routine annual exercise, or maybe every 2 years. I have a couple other questions, but I'll let you proceed with the presentation.
And I'm pretty much there, besides doing dynamic scenarios of things that you want to bring in. But I want to also point out, I'm working with quite a few agencies, even up north. And then one is very close here is Lodi. And Lodi, they're where you're going to be. They're just doing CPI adjustments. They might have a 4%, 5% here and there, but they feel that because it's 2 years out, 3 years out, let's still just do CPI. And I think, they think they're going to be fine with, cost saving measures, other things like that. But ultimately, the goal back then was get you more in a position where you're going to be at single digits. And for your Prop 218, you still have to come forward with a new plan every 5 years. So in some instances, it seems like, wait a minute, we just did a rate increase, but you're required to have this report as part of your administrative record. So if you will, if there's anything else you would like to see, again, my recommendation would be to stay on course at the 10%. I know time has went by for it to be in January, and then to minimize the conservation component by half, or at least half, and then you're going to be fine through the rest of the current study period, and then you're going to be doing a full cost service study in 2021 for 2022 and beyond.
And so I think you're going to show us that scenario that if we did that for those years.
And this is it.
What if it's by 75%, more in line with maybe the previous year or the last 3 years' demand on that program?
Yeah, I'd like to see that.
75%? Yeah, I could do that.
Am I
as well.
right? I mean, we average
70 or something, pretty close to that.
I think I have it as a separate component.
It probably comes out to about that, right?
Yeah.
25% of
25%.
250.
So then it would generate 750,000
Well,
It's-
75%. Yeah.
instead of the million.
I was just saying with the after effects in terms of future years and, yeah.
Sure. It's slight. It barely changes the outer years. for your reserves.
Habib, let me ask you a question if I could, Mayor.
Yes.
Of course.
So if you're talking about reducing the water conservation charges, do you have the water conservation expenditures built into the model as well?
No, not its own separate component, but I know with the 1.2 million that's available, you could spread that out over numerous years. That could probably cover your, with the 750,000 coming in, based on your current expenses, you're covering what you have seen in any of the years so far. And then you still have the 1.2 to mitigate any shortfall in future years, if it ramps up.
But in doing your comparison, you say, okay, if we drop this by, I think you did 50%, you show it how it impacts the rest of the balance moving forward. So I'm assuming that you don't then have the water conservation projects built into the expenses that are in there.
No, I do not.
Which is a good point as we talk about inflation and the cost compared to now, or 5 years from now, like Mayor Pro Tem was talking about. And then there's other issues, not to muddy the waters, but energy rates and things of that nature that are going to certainly increase that we really can't factor in. I mean, there may be a formula to do so, but.
Right, and I'm sure
I'm
Habib
sorry.
has built that in.
I do have. I'm sorry. As part of this update, you gave me the roughly 450,000 in operating conservation, and then the capital is in there as well for any project in your current capital that is considered a eligible expense that could be funded. But this 450 is then escalated in future years, so it continues to grow.
Oh, and that is built into it.
Yeah, it is
So
built
when you
into
drop-
it. Yeah, the
Excuse me, when-
operating takes into account the conservation program costs. That's correct.
Okay, so when you drop the revenues, we should also drop those expenditures, or does that automatically flow through to that?
No, I still have it assuming that those expenditures are still there, unless you need to reduce it. But right now, even cutting it at 75%, your revenues from the conservation component still is more than the operating conservation plan. So then you still have some dollars for the capital component for conservation.
Okay, and a good thing about this model is he can change any number on there and tell you how it affects it. So, Habib, could you change the $24 million?
Yeah, say you
Yes.
don't do a bond.
Right, or no, just make that a lower dollar amount just to see how that flows through.
How about I cut it in half so you see something a little bit more drastic?
Drastic, yeah.
So if you cut it in half, so you just have that amount of proceeds, but then
Gee whiz.
you can only, it's like buying your house, right? Who has the ability to buy your house cash? I mean, you're going to get a loan to spread it out over 30 years. So this is showing kind of the same thing. You're now going to spend all your cash on hand to cover, $12 million. Or the other half, yeah, 12 million.
Then on the capital side as well, so if,
So that's interesting because that's where you were before. If the storage facility isn't something that could just continue to be maintained, that's something that is scheduled to be repaired and replaced. So that would still need to be repaired and replaced. And I don't know if.
So one of the things we're looking at now is the possibility of doing a smaller size water storage. I believe, Keith, you're looking at that possibility, correct?
That's
So
correct.
it may be a less expensive
Okay.
capital outlay, and if you can try that, let's say that is,
Yeah.
instead of $24 million, well, yeah, just drop that.
How much smaller are you looking at? We went from a 7.5 now to 6.9, and now we're going.
Well, the size of the tank that's shown in the master plan is 6.8 million gallons. We're using most current water usage per capita and every other tool that we have to go ahead and refine that downward. What we know is water usage is down, and it's being borne out in the rates that you see here right now. So when we get done with that, the tank could be reduced by some amount. Don't know exactly what that might be right now. It could be that we go ahead and stage the tank and do two smaller ones, do a first one up front, But that's part of the study, is to go ahead and figure out, whether we can go ahead and adjust the tank size or number.
And I apologize, what was the reduced amount for that scenario? Instead of cut it by 12 million?
Say by 5 million, cut it by 5 million.
Oh, sorry, I need to change the scenario. I'm still on number 1. Let me change capital to
Go
scenario
back to the
2.
default.
So then if that happens, you could get by with just a $12 million bond issue, and you're going to be hovering right around your minimum requirement. And now your debt obligation is a lot lower. So it's really easy for you to maintain your debt coverage.
And I wasn't really trying to suggest any changes like that. I'm just letting you see how the model changes when you change the variables within the model.
One of the, I'm sorry.
Councilwoman Gallegos been waiting.
Habib, the question I have is, you mentioned Lodi and other cities that you've worked with.
Yes.
What is the percentage they use for the conservation?
They don't really have a full-blown conservation program. I think it's just kind of in their operating, but I think it's fairly minimal compared to the program that's being built here. When we first did this study, I remember that there wasn't much of a conservation program here, and we even had options of having conservation component to generate 500,000, 750,000, $1 million, and the council decided to go with $1 million. But you're in your infancy. You don't really know what's going to be the reaction of customers taking advantage of it, and now you're finding make modifications for your customers to really come forward and use those funds.
So can you show me, we have it at 50%, right?
75 right now.
Yeah, 50%.
So I think it's at 50.
Let me check.
We changed it to
Basically changed it to
75.
75.
Yeah, so
Yeah, it's 75, so I could go to 50.
And then no increase until 2023?
And what about the current increases that are already?
5%, 5%?
I believe those.
And then the last one was
No,
3.
19, 0, 0. Nothing until 20, let's say nothing until 22.
Nothing until 22, so then you're going to need that council would need like 10% adjustments.
3 years in a row.
At least.
That's what I wanted to see.
So then you're back to,
Where we
to
were.
a certain extent,
Yeah.
tying the hands of the next council to make difficult decisions.
And that's at a $12 million bond though, right? You're bonding at 12 million.
That's a good point. Yes, that's out of 12 million. If I put it back to the,
24, then how would that look?
it would be even worse. So I'll change the scenario, the capital back to the original, which had the 5 million. I'll put the 24 to cover that capital expense.
That's just not water storage.
No.
And actually, with that amount of proceeds, you're gonna be okay. But this is problematic right there. Your rating agencies are gonna be a little concerned about getting so close to your requirement. They're gonna want to see a little bit more revenue coming in than.
So now you're looking at more than a 10% increase that first year.
Right.
Is that 50% conservation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I think that if we left the capital improvement there, the rate where it's at, and the 50% of the conservation with the original model that you had, I think that set like a pretty good, it didn't look, I mean, the model that you showed there looked fairly adequate
Correct.
for our city. It didn't really look like we were gonna dip into any problems for quite some time.
And that was with assumption where I said January for the rates that were already adopted. So there, you just showed a 6-month delay, and with conservation being cut by half. Granted, you have those later years that you're below the minimum, but you're still at, I think, right around $4 million in your coffers.
So at the end of the day, if I'm talking about an individual ratepayer, I mean, it increases on their flat rate, but on their tier 2 and tier 3, you would see a reduction. So in a sense, it kind of washes out, right?
Yeah, if you did like a bill impact to the average customer, what would be the impact? I would say that's true, because your tier 2 and tier 3 are coming down so much.
And that's where the majority of these ratepayers are paying. And I mean, we're $1.2 million that we have. And I could see that as a reduction and hopefully alleviating some of the issues that we face with that.
Yes, Councilmember, you're correct. If I put it where it was, and I think most of your customers are 3/4. Let me just let me refresh my memory. Is it 1 inch? Oh yeah, almost all your customers are 1 inch. So 1 inch customer is $22. Average usage is probably like 15, 16 units of water, right around there.
20s.
Mid-20s,
Mm.
average use. So if it's mid-20s, you're gonna be in tier 2. You're gonna be at, let's see, I'll just do the 10 times this, and then you're gonna be another, you said 22, mid-20, 25, 15 times that, plus 15 times this guy. So 52, and that'd be $75 versus if I made this 100. Versus at the 100%, it's $78. So, but the 50% cut, they save $3 on their bill.
But they increase on that 10%. How much more? That was like $2-3 more. So kind of.
I have a schedule, I think, that I can show that would illustrate that.
If you remove the 10.
Yeah, it's around $2. The meter charge
Yeah.
went up by $2, and then
Yeah,
they save
so-
$3. That's correct.
So, I mean, it's in a way. I mean,
Yeah, because you can
why,
see
if anything, you're
the cell I have right now. This is the current.
yes.
The proposed will go up by just $2.10.
But at that 50% conservation, then
Cuts that.
and it really
Correct.
doesn't affect, moving forward.
Right.
And we continue to go on the course that the previous council had, so that in the future, we're not looking to dire circumstances, kind of like what we're facing before.
Yeah, a person using 25 units of water with conservation at 100% would be paying essentially the same as cutting the conservation by 50% and keeping the 10% increase that's scheduled. That is correct.
And it's status quo, in
Right.
a way, right? So we're not really.
Correct.
Councilman Oliver.
Mr. Mayor, had a couple topics I wanted to cover based on my colleagues' great questions, but piggybacking on that, didn't we almost suggest too, given the amount that we do have in reserves, that we can almost eliminate that as far as the conservation? We can increase rates, or increase those amounts in future years, especially if we have more demand on the program. But right now, we're sitting on 1.2 million that hasn't been programmed. Maybe part of it will be. Could that be a consideration as well in factoring that in?
Yes, and then do you want me to then eliminate the program's cost of like at least the operating of $450,000 a year?
Well, I think there's certain components of it that we would want to maintain, right? That we fund.
Yeah, patrol you'd want to maintain.
Patrol, and I think we would still
Your
want to cover a
maintenance.
portion of the incentives and whatnot, but we have 1.2 million that's sitting there now that can be programmed into those operating expenditures in future years, correct? So rather than charging people more, we're at a 50% conservation to continue to build on those reserves, maybe programming those dollars, towards active expenditures, right? Or
I'm tracking with what you're saying.
incentives.
I don't know if I agree yet, but.
And then we make adjustments based on if the demand increases, we see more turf replacements, we might have to come back and make a readjustment. We can because our rates set that ceiling.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
So I'm not sure if this is exactly what the council member is asking for, but we do have a schedule ready here that, let's say we dropped the water conservation by 70%. So see the number there, water conservation reduction is not 70%, but it's dropping it by 70%.
Yeah.
Then the revenues, and this is assuming this would all happen beginning in fiscal year 1920, the revenues would go from 876 to an estimated $263,000.
But we still don't tackle what we do with that 1.2 million.
Right, so, and this is, you'll notice there's minimal projects scheduled out here. So we've got the staff covered, we've got $100,000 for conservation rebates, $60,000 for parks conservation for median landscaping, monitoring meters and such, but we don't have any projects in here. So this is pretty much bare bones without any projects happening after fiscal year 18-19. If that happens, then this is what happens. The balance goes from $1.26 million down to 1.1 to 940,000 to 770. So even at the end of fiscal year 21-22, we would still have a balance of $770,000 that we could use going forward, or maybe there's another $770,000 of projects that were discussed by David this evening that you'd like to pursue. It's up to council to decide what you want to keep in that in those projects.
I think
But does this show you what you're asking for?
Yeah, I'm trying to, to show, we're sitting on the 1.2. I don't think we have, he provided a menu of projects, which I think have potential, but I think we need more time to gather data on what the water savings are, whether it be with our project with the school district or the percolation ponds. I think we're going to want to see more data and see what that return on investment is in terms of conservation. So I don't want to do away with those or take them off the shelf, but at the same time, I would rather lessen the burden on ratepayers today based on what we have in those reserves, knowing that we can always come back and increase that ceiling in the conservation program, or increase that rate in the conservation program. Let's say that the turf replacement takes off and we're seeing, much more demand and we need to increase it now. I would be amenable to that, but I just wanted to point that out. Maybe there's a consideration where we reduce it and we allow that reserve to kind of fund some of those ongoing expenditures, at least throughout the remaining period of this 5-year increase.
Do you want to look at a different percentage than 70%? What number do you want me to drop in there?
50,
He wants you to look at 0.
up 50. Oh, wow.
Would be 100%.
Oh, 100%, sorry.
So it's a 0% reduction.
No, I'm sorry, it'd be 100%.
100% if it's reduction.
Yeah.
Where did that go wrong? Goes down to $19,000 in the hole.
If you keep it
If you keep,
year after year. And again, I think this needs to be a annual exercise where we're looking at the demand on, on our program and the interest of our constituency, the viability of conservation projects with data behind them to show where we get our most bang for our buck, so to speak. So I'm not suggesting that's where we should go tonight, but I just wanted to, kind of factor that in there. Just a couple other questions I had. You mentioned about 70% of our usage is, single-family residential. Do you recall what it is for industrial and commercial?
I could look that up real quick. Non-residential is about 18%, 20%.
The reason why I asked that is in thinking of ways to reduce project costs for future capital expenditures like the storage. One example I've seen that other cities have used is EDA funds for water storage projects, or a portion of, so I think it'd be more of a question and task of staff, and I wish Yvette was still here. But one in particular was able to derive an analysis that showed with this new water storage, it's not only gonna supply single-family residential, but there's an impact on our industrial and commercial viability for future job generation projects. So without stable water supply, you know, you're gonna have difficulty in attracting, you know, commercial, industrial users, and so that might be a component I think we should look at, and I'd love to follow up with staff afterwards, and citing that the city, in particular that I'm thinking of, in terms of using EDA dollars. We might have to update our SEDS, but I think we could draw on a nexus to, you know, expansion of storage like that, the impact that would have for our industrial and commercial job generators as well. And then my last question, Bede, for you is, I'm looking at other cities, what examples have you seen, if any? I've asked this question of our city attorney, and I don't think we have many examples, but where we might be able to take into consideration, you know, the hardship that might be present on an individual on fixed income or low income or a senior. Have you seen any examples where they've taken, let's say, revenues derived from fines on ratepayers for maybe not watering on the right day or whatnot? Have you seen that in terms of creating an incentive there or reduction based on that hardship?
Yeah, so Prop 218 kind of ties our hands to a certain extent because no other customer could subsidize another. So the one thing we can't do is increase rates on one person to subsidize another. But fines are allowed. Yeah. The only thing with fines is that it's a very small number and it's not a stable revenue stream. Mm-hmm. We have some agencies or even independent water districts have property tax that they could allocate a certain portion, but that's very difficult because a lot of times property taxes in those situations are primarily used for capital. We have seen some agencies have a program for hardship that's really based on donations. One of my biggest clients is the city of San Diego for the next 5 years, and they have a program called H2O, where anyone could put in a certain donation on their bill. It's like a little insert, or not even insert, it's part of it, just check and dollar amount. And so San Diego has 270,000 accounts, and that generates around only 150,000 a year. I mean, their water enterprise is, you know, 300-400 million, and to think that on that much many customers and that much revenue, rates coming in, it only collects 150,000 a year. It kind of shows you, you know, how successful that type of program is. Other states, you have the ability to even just do subsidies or different utility like electric, but with water and sewer, you can't do it within the rate structure itself.
Thank you.
I do want to mention one other thing, just to be fully transparent on one of the comments you made with what if we just reduce it down and until those funds are spent? Well, then that cuts these later years, right? So then I would have to assume that then to meet your reserves, because we would have to increase the base rates to ensure that the reserves are covered. So these percents of fours will have to go up by 1% or 2%. So I just want to make sure I'm transparent and keep that in mind based on any decisions you make. But you aren't making any decisions tonight. This is just informative, and I'm more than happy to answer any more questions that you may have.
Councilman Rigby has a question.
One of the questions I had, I guess, is more towards for staff. Mr. Butcher, one of the elements that we haven't really talked about is the development impact fee study that we're conducting, and what type of impact could that have on O&M costs and the CIPs that we've been looking at tonight? I mean, is that one other element that could help us sort of balance the level of increase in which we're trying to get to?
Yeah, and unfortunately not. The development impact fee program, by definition, covers capital cost, and so it doesn't enable us to really address O&M cost to any significant degree. there is some overlap between the improvements that are covered in the fee program and those that are covered in the rates. So for instance, the tank improvements, those are fairly assessed, at least a portion of those are fairly assessed to new development, but they also have to be incorporated into the rate study to allow for debt to be issued to cover the cost. So even by recognizing that a portion of those costs can be covered by and should be covered by new development, it doesn't really allow us to adjust the fee or the revenue needs for the rates and lower the rates accordingly. The number of new water wells, for instance, that's included in the rate CIP is nominal in relation to the number of wells covered in the development impact fee program. And so the capital needs for development impact fees are really a different set of improvements that are covered by the rates, and that's by definition. It's sort of that logical separation of improvement types. New development pays for new pipes, and rates pay for replacements of existing pipes, basically.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Councilman Robinson.
Yes, I was, I attended the GSA with David Merchant, and you guys were discussing the potential, water conservation project, like reducing or not using, or 50%, he said. And so I'm wondering, with the GSA, the project we have, to reduce the water usage, you have to come into effect. We have to start planning. What do you think about that, Dave?
It's one of the things I addressed briefly going in, where we know that we're going to have to engage in some conservation activities, and I put the slide up where it showed that our current overdraft is about 3,300 acre feet. There's a couple different ways to measure that, but that's the methodology that's been used across the subbasin at this point. So the good news is I think we're going to be able to address that number. I think we've got some assets, some tools at our disposal. I think we've already saved, reduced consumption quite a bit since 2014, and we get to kind of take credit for that. We get to build that into our overall balance needs. We also control some ag land. We own some ag land that we lease around the airport. We can reduce that over time in terms of the amount of water that gets used there, or require that MID contracts be used. We also have a partnership with MID, a budding partnership with MID, a long relationship, but in terms of a specific partnership to put water in basins, MID has expressed a willingness. We have a special relationship with them that other GSAs don't have, because 90% of our city is within the MID boundaries. So I think we have tools there, but as I mentioned, I think that burden is going to be impressed upon us to continue to work with the community to understand that we don't have all the water that we need, and it's going to be a constant measure going forward to show that we're sustainable. And the burden of new development going forward is going to be tough to make. I mean, you can effectively determine how much of your ag land you produce in almonds and how much you keep fallow, and that that kind of relationship affects ag land and ag owners absolutely 100%. That's where our economy is anchored in and around the city, so it's important to us. But if property coming into the city for development purposes needs to show a sustainable yield that's well below the amount of water that average development uses, even under good situations, we're going to need to find a way to help balance that. So this is the world according to Dave Merchant, and it's early in the process, but we can't really afford to use all the easy stuff, the low-hanging fruit, to balance today's deficit, because I think we're going to need some of that to soften the burden going forward, or we could very quickly find ourselves stifled.
Exactly, and that's one of the many takeaways this evening, and I appreciate council's vision and foresight in that we don't want the next council to have to go through what we had to do as you pointed out again, Mr. Isaac, on what we did in 14-15 with our situation that we were in. Also understanding that we don't want this to be a huge burden on our ratepayer. So we're trying to find that happy medium.
Also, you know, there new legislation from the state about the 55 gallon. You know, I have to do more in-depth studies about it, but is it 55 gallon per day per person, or?
Right. It's very difficult to pin that down on the average ratepayer and the average usage. And that's also another good point. If we had 3 years of above rainwater, sometimes the conversations are different. We don't know if we're going to be in a 3-year drought or a 2-year drought, and things certainly turn. That we can't anticipate. You know, when it comes to tax revenues, we have a best guess scenario, you know, things of that nature. But we really have no idea if we're going to end up in that drought. Councilman Robinson.
You know, like more variables. You know, like for instance, recently, federal government said that they're going to release more water for this Central Valley.
Mm.
So that take into effect that also. You know.
I don't know if into effect or into consideration. It's something to certainly consider, but you know, we'll know it when we see it. But Councilman Oliver had a very good point that I certainly agree with, in that because it is so important to us, this isn't something that we shouldn't, even if we are comfortable with our usage and comfortable with the amount of rainwater we get and comfortable with our rates, it's not anything that we want to sneak up on us or future councils. And so whether it's an update, I think that investment on the front end is very, very important to do so from staff and our Raftellus, to just let us know what the horizon looks like. That is certainly very, very important, more so than coming back every 5 years or putting this on the backs of the next council. We need to we just know where we're going. We certainly know where we've been. And so it does say this evening, Mr. Merchant, that we are looking for some sort of direction. And so I'm not sure if you want to spell that out on what you'd like to hear from council, other than all the questions and concerns, what we've talked about already.
So the discussion this evening was scheduled in consideration of previous direction from the council to do the things that have been done. If there was specific direction on adjusting the conservation component of the rates, as an example, something defined, something that is already in the rate structure, I think that's something that you could do, and we could bring back that as an action item. It gets a little trickier beyond that in terms of switching the burden of cost between tiers or modifying the tier structure. That would trigger probably a new study from Raftellus and a new 218 election. Habib is nodding his head yes, saying yes, that would be triggered. Another alternative, if you're not prepared to provide direction on a specific adjustment, is that we can go back and consider the comments that we've received this evening and bring back to you some more well-defined scenarios that can be accomplished under the current structure without triggering a 218, if that's a goal. If you're prepared to go through another 218 process, then I think we need to talk about what we want to accomplish, and we can do that.
What I'd like to see personally, Dave, going back to your analogy of the alphabet soup, if that can kind of be broken down, if we have less conservation dollars, what pots of money do we have to pull from, which you had mentioned developer impact fees. So I think kind of to where Councilman Rigby was alluding to. And also the projects, we talked about those projects like gray water projects and that whole list. We have them by name, but there's really no dollar amount to those. So as we talk about the reduction of conservation dollars with these projects, I don't see a cost to those. So if we are going to, if that is our wish list, and we are going to look at those by name, we have to look at those by dollar amounts and what would it cost us in the near future, and if we put it off, what would it then cost us in the later years? And so where we could save on conservation dollars, what would it cost the city if we don't move forward on some of those projects? So I'd like to, that is right at the exact same time, so I'll let you guys decide who goes first. Councilman Rigby.
I think I share the same sentiments as the mayor. I'd like to, I think the Mayor Pro Tem brought up a great point when we were kind of talking about, where are we at if we do cut conservation by 50% from 100%, and then with Mr. Isaac being able to show us, well, you're saving a total of $3 in some scenarios, and I think that's important, because if we're talking about cutting conservation and we have some viable projects that are going to save us large amounts of water, then that's probably something that I would like to be able to pursue, knowing that we're saving the ratepayer $3, but we could, where do we tip the balance? My number one goal is, how do we save ratepayers money today? That is my number one goal as a council member, and so I've got to have better numbers. Particularly, I would have loved to have had some of these graphs included in my staff report, some of these numbers included in my staff report. So I don't know if we're even going to get to look at the PowerPoint that was presented tonight, but if not, I would like that forwarded. I don't know if I'm speaking on behalf of all of council, but those would be some graphs and numbers, charts that I'd like to have to be able to go back when we do come back as a council with some of these suggestions, to be able to reference moving forward. But I would like to know, how much is a leak detection project going to cost us? I think the percolation basin numbers that Will was asking for, I think those are important as well. And so I'm not ready to make any drastic moves tonight. I kind of wanted to get out there my intentions. I appreciate Mr. Isaac's input, being able to take or reduce the reserve target. I think that's big. Stuff like that is the sort of suggestions this council needs to continue to hear, and so I appreciate that.
Yeah, well said. And not only the amount of what those projects would cost, but what that would save our city in the long run through those efforts, and whether it be continually working with Madera Unified or Graywater for future development. We have a lot of development that's on the horizon. And so maybe a small development it may not be attractive to, but as we explored and went forward with the downtown incentive program, it seems to be working out really well on the front end. That may be something that we certainly need to consider. So yeah, I certainly agree with you, Mr. Councilman. Councilman Oliver.
I definitely appreciate those sentiments, and I'm all about investing in infrastructure and viable projects. And I think even what was proposed, I don't think that even scratches the surface as to the type of innovative approaches we can take in looking at ways to yield as much water savings as possible. I think it may even warrant a whole separate discussion. As far as Graywater, I don't want to give that up. I think, unfortunately, we didn't have a template for potential applicants to utilize. And as we mentioned back then, it wasn't realistic for someone to MacGyver a system based on, what they're able to buy at GBS. So it's difficult without having that template. And I think in terms of Graywater, I think the state's going to probably be requiring it at some point, and I think it should be potentially looked at as a new development standard. And that's something that we should, maybe carefully examine, especially with, new development on the horizon. For me, from what I recall in 2015 and looking back at the record and the meeting minutes, we were, undergoing probably the worst drought since the late 1970s, and it probably even surpassed that in terms of impact on our communities, especially given that we have largely an agricultural community. So we're getting hit from different ends, from the state requiring significant mandates, from Mother Nature, and obviously from, past decisions. And so we had a pretty difficult hand to be dealt. But in terms of conservation too, I do know what kind of drove that discussion was the incentives, and that, hey, it's realistic that we can exhaust $500,000 worth of turf replacements and gray water systems and more efficient low flow toilets, and frankly we're just not there. I mean, the demand's not there, the community's not there. I wish that we were. So in the immediate order, I think we do need to derive good data from some of these projects we've already initiated, especially with the school district, with these percolation ponds, with the turf replacement projects that we've already awarded and will subsequently award. But I would be amenable to scaling back that conservation program beginning today at the 50% amount, because I don't think it's going to compromise the integrity or the intent of the program. I think we still have dollars in those reserves that can meet, could be utilized for projects that are viable. And I just hate to not do anything and then come back a year from now or 2 years from now and say, okay, what worked, what didn't work, and it's just, I'd hate to sit on that and look at that amount and not make. I think the way that the rate structure is built today, we have the ability, we have a ceiling to work within. And if we come back a year from now and there's a 25% increase in our turf replacement program or its interest, then we should maybe look at making those adjustments based on the consumer demand. So that would be my recommendation. It'd be beginning with that conservation program, but this should be an active discussion, at least on an annual basis, where we look at all these factors and look at the long-term implications that it will have on future councils as well. So dating back to that discussion in 2015, I just don't see the demand there right now. Not to say that these other projects aren't viable, they probably are, but I guarantee, I bet you there's many more that we could probably identify too. So it needs to be a more ongoing discussion, I think, with our colleagues serving on the GSA that's been formed with Mr. Merchant's leadership on that body. I think we're going to come back with a lot of different innovative approaches, and we're going to be challenged and forced to. So that would be my preference, is that we start somewhere with the conservation and kind of keep it aligned with the demand.
Point well taken. Mayor Pro Tem Rodriguez.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Medellin. And I too have to share the same feeling that colleague Oliver had. I think, if we can do, if this council would agree on something, is that we definitely want to save the ratepayers' money. And having that reserve money there, I think we can definitely shrink that conservation and reduce that down to 50%. I think that would be a good approach, especially now. And moving forward, as Councilman Oliver said, we can always revisit the areas that are in need, and we can always make those adjustments. 'Cause I think we have that flexibility, and I think you pointed that out, Habib. One of the things that Councilman Rigby brought up was the PowerPoint, and I think that would have served us great. I mean, especially that Excel sheet. I'm not sure if it's proprietary to you, but if we can have a copy of that, I can definitely solve the national debt crisis.
Yeah.
I can plug in some numbers there and definitely send that to my congressman. But no, I think that's important. And going back to the conservation deal, I got to say that I did take advantage of that, and I was the contractor there because I installed the toilet, and my wife received, turned in her receipt, and she got something. So the advice or the notices are out there because I see them, and she takes a look at them, and bless her heart, she looks at everything that we can get as a bargain. And obviously installing a new toilet, which we needed, and being that it's reduces water, obviously that helps people. So what you've been doing already by providing these notices do help. And I know people are reading them, and it's just a matter, there's not a lot of engagement. I don't know if we can stimulate that more by adding more things. I'm not sure if the cost, we talked about, what do we got to do, but you got to factor in cost when you do that as well. And then kind of weigh out if it's worth it or not. But I have to agree that at this point where we're at now, I think it would be a good approach for this council to move forward on possibly reducing that 50%. And all the other programs that were, not programs, but the other projects that were there as well, I think they're great projects. But those projects, again, with the $1.2 million reserve that we have, we can always, allocate funds for that moving forward and what have you. But so back to that sheet, is that something that we can have, or? Okay. No, there you go. It was a good tool. Thank you.
You can buy the software for about 50 grand, maybe.
An Excel.
I certainly agree. I do want to add to that in what I had mentioned before, in our efforts as a city to reach our community. We are certainly privy to this information, And sometimes I think we understand that we send it out on a bill and we think that everybody's gonna read that bill and everybody's gonna understand. And I think, once again, we use Joseph Corello, who's just a wizard on making videos and things of that nature, possibly the paper, or whatever efforts we use. I just think we need to increase those efforts somehow, some way, and letting our ratepayer know that there are conservation dollars out there. And I don't have it in front of me. I'm not sure how easy or difficult it is, if it's just a matter of turning in a receipt or having a licensed contractor replace your turf. But that would be something to be considered as well, because that is the point. Conservation dollars are there, and we are asking people to take advantage of it. And so we need to do everything in our power to make sure that our ratepayers are understanding what's going on. And at the same, in the same breath, include them in these decisions that we're making. I think that's the story that we need to tell as to why and how we have those dollars there, and why they're available, and how do we get to that point. So I certainly have no problem with that, as long as our outreach is increased. Councilwoman Gallegos.
Mayor Matil, I want to piggyback on that. And we talked about education to our community members about our rebates. How about if we have I know we have a flyer that kind of talks about it, that's something maybe Neighborhood Watch. We're hitting right to the door to our residents, and they spread the word. If there's sort of type of flyer that Christina could hand out, or make that part of one of the 3 meetings, that's a component to it.
Yeah, absolutely. When Measure K, when we were asking for support at Measure K through Neighborhood Watch, that's exactly what we did. And as we talk about almost any issue, really, that's what Neighborhood Watch is about, is to get information out there. And so we have over 100 neighborhoods participating, but still a very small percentage when it comes to our ratepayer. That's a great avenue, Councilwoman, and that should be part of many avenues we should take to reach the community. Councilman Oliver.
That's an excellent idea, and I agree. We got to boost our outreach and marketing efforts. I think we should go back and try to co-market as best we can with our existing stores. So if GBS can, or whoever, can confirm that this particular type of toilet meets the city's, conservation guidelines, why couldn't they have next to there that it may be eligible for a rebate?
Absolutely. Good point.
And so I think that partnership with our local business community can help a great deal in kind of getting that word out. And that way we don't have to go to the consumer. We already have people that are already, interested in buying those applications that they could maybe then consider it. So.
Yeah, no, a very good point. Mayor Pro Tem Rodriguez.
Yeah, and now that we're throwing ideas out, I thought that was a great idea. But I want to also piggyback on your suggestion, Mayor Medellin, is utilizing Joseph. And, what better way can we do that than by really, maybe setting up a short film, maybe something small on Facebook that really outlines exactly how people can take advantage of something like this. I can't remember where, but not too long ago I flushed this toilet somewhere, and I could have sworn that thing was swirling for minutes. And, people don't understand, and people are becoming aware, especially your conservation efforts that not only the city but the state's putting out there. But this thing was moving, and I go, when is that going to go down? But, this would be a good opportunity for someone to, hey, illustrate if this was happening in your home, conserve water by installing a new toilet that probably has this capacity of water, it saves you this much water, and here's how you would do it. And follow the example, get a receipt, get your money back, and there you go. You might have a lot of toilets out in the dump, but nevertheless, it really helps that conservation approach, and again, saved us money. But I would utilize that in what people in today's terms like to utilize as video format or Facebook or what have you. And I know that the paper is still really good, but it seems like our generation is just going through that, Twitter, Facebook, and I don't know all the names of all the social medias, but I'm sure Councilman Oliver can share some of those with us here.
Tinder, is that what it is?
I knew you were going to go there.
You knew I would.
Sounds like, Mayor Pro Tem, it sounds like you're gunning to be a star in a commercial.
Well, no.
It's a billboard.
The
Mr.
toilet,
Low flow
I think
Joe.
the toilet that he installed at his house, he wants to now be in a
I
commercial
gotta
showing
tell-
that he actually did it.
I got to tell you that, one little press, and it's just like quick, and you'd be surprised, like, okay, I know I saved me some water there. But again, it just takes someone that can go out there and present it in a fashion. And if it happens to be me where I have to flush a toilet to show people and conserve water, then I'll do that. But, you know, I think there's actors out there that we can hire, or people that are like you, Mayor. You're a presentable figure in our community, so I think that would serve you best. And maybe
Yeah.
I'd be on the background with a plunger or something.
You can hand me the wrench.
That's right.
How about that? You know, using the Association of Realtors, I think we all agree that there's a number of ways that we can enhance our outreach. And, you know, I mean, who better than those that are selling homes or buying homes and you know, doing that. So it's going to be a community effort, a collaborative effort, but nevertheless, it's going to be an effort that we need to increase.
Definitely.
Councilwoman Gallegos.
Before this came on the agenda, we know we have quite a bit of money in the conservation budget. So Mr. Scarborough and I have ventured to look at a way to conserve water on shower heads. And we have a company in Core School that actually makes them and distributes them throughout, even in different countries, not even in the state of California, throughout the state of California, throughout different countries. And it's bigger drops that saves water in your showers. And so we're looking into that and using that conservation dollars to maybe save money. And I have purchased one personally, and my water bill did go down. And because I had sat with Tim, help me, the water. Her name. No. Ann, I sat with Ann, and I said, how come I'm using more water in the winter? Because I'm watering my lawn. And she said, well, usually people in winter take longer showers because they're cold and the water's hot. So the shower heads save water, big time water. So Mr. Scarborough is looking into that, and hopefully we can use some conservation dollars on that. That'll be exciting.
Any other comments or questions? I think we have direction.
I'm not sure we have direction. I'm not sure I heard direction. I think there was interest in, from at least some members of the council, in putting together a reduction in the conservation element as soon as could be done. And I think there was also some interest in adding some more definition and regarding both cost and conservation savings relative to the projects. So the question I would have is there interest from, you know, not that I'm counting heads or anything, but is there direction from the council as a whole to bring back to you an adjustment to the rates to reflect a drop in the conservation program?
Yes, please.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes.
So if, can I
Go
add,
right ahead.
can I add something there? Sorry, I had to come up here. I think Sonia shut off my microphone over there. It's not, I couldn't get it to work. So Habib has given us his presentation. He's basically saying we should stick with the plan. In his plan, he proposed certain dates, which will have an impact on it, and he was saying we could make it effective July 1st or January 1st. Another option might be pushing that off till July 1st, and then the question would be timing. Do you want to do the increase the same time that you have the reduction in water conservation to kind of balance each other? I think one of the council members mentioned you would balance that out. So just the timing issues. And do we want to move forward with the scheduled 10% increase? If so, when? So those are some of the questions to consider as you're giving direction to staff, I believe.
I know we have a lot on our plate on the next 3 or 4 meetings for the rest of the year before January 1. And so theoretically, how soon can we get some of those answers back, Dave, on what we had asked as far as cost of projects and things like that? Would it be before January 1?
If there's a request from the council to move with urgency, then we'll make it a priority and get it done in the next few weeks. We could do it at the first meeting. We typically keep light in December due to council reorg, but that would probably mean at this point that it would be the second meeting in December.
At the soonest. Because personally, I like the recommendation of sticking to the plan that we have at hand. I like where council wants to go with savings, but in all honesty, that savings is not a huge savings to the ratepayer, especially as we enter into these next winter months, which is less usage. So I'm certainly would love to reduce where we can to the ratepayer, but in the next few months, we're not talking about big dollars, right? Or
Hot showers, long.
Well, I think you're still going to have customers in tier 2, and maybe not as many in tier 3 in the winter, but a lot of your customers still go in tier 2 every single month. It's not like everyone is only using tier 1 water when winter comes around, and it's supposed to be winter, but even right now it's still fairly warm, and
you're still on.
and usually it takes time before people actually react to change their systems. So just to re-clarify, my recommendation was to stay the course in terms of the rate adjustments, but reduce the reserves, target, and then cut the conservation by 50%. So that was what seemed to be reasonable, and still be in a situation where you're looking at very modest adjustments in your next study.
And you were suggesting a target date of January 1.
Oh, that's correct. And all this is administrative because you've already noticed these rates. So this is, it's just an administrative function. I understand that action needs to be taken and things of that sort, but it's not like a public hearing. It's something that could just be brought to you then and administratively done before January 1st in terms of the billing system.
And so if that's what council decides to do, and I'm thinking in parallel here, one, we have that 50% reduction, and two, we have the questions and concerns that we have for Dave. So are those two different things? One of them would take a priority as far as 50% reduction, it's just administrative, and the other one we could bring back as
Yeah, I think the biggest philosophical issue, if you can call it that, is that a 50% reduction would largely take away the ongoing ability to construct, capital projects. There will still be some money in there, and the existing pool would still be available. But in terms of an ongoing revenue source, if your intention is to be able to build some of these projects, to implement some of these things, then you would want to hold off on that. If that's less important at this point, and that's certainly a fair way to look at it, then you can proceed as you define, and then we would be essentially looking at how to phase projects in that might be, so instead of looking at a single $1 million smart clock installation project, maybe you're spending $200,000 a year over 5 years. Something like that. And that's why when we talk about those projects are scalable and feasible, there's almost none of those projects that couldn't be done over a period of time, but you might be looking at one instead of 3 or 4.
and it's hard to discern that without amounts, personally. I mean, you had mentioned one of them is we could, in the stroke of a pen, it could be $1 million, one project.
Right.
But you had 7 or 8 different projects on there. So that was where I was coming from, in that if we could get that in the next 60 days, and I know we're kind of pushing things, sticking with the plan, it might help council understand a little bit better if it's something that we want to push off, or if it does become a priority, as far as percolation basins and things like that, and what our priority is going to be. It's my thoughts.
And if we are going to reduce the conservation to 50%, I'd kind of like to know what within the program would we be able to still fund, like patrol, meter maintenance, the education, the miscellaneous stuff to parks. Would we still be able to? I think under the model that Councilmember Oliver and the Mayor Pro Tem were offering, we would be able to exhaust that, what we already have in the reserve fund, until 2022. But again, without those numbers, it's hard for me personally as well to make that decision.
So I'll try to respond to that. We had looked at reducing this at, actually to 100%. That would take it beyond zero. If we reduced it to 50%, I think the easiest answer was we'd still get about half of this, so $430,000 a year worth of projects that we could do and still to add to this, because there's no projects in here, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay.
So basically, 50% would be half of this, and that amount, even without that coming in, basically we could last almost 3 years, or through 21, 22. So that would leave basically, well, this amount, $438,473 a year for projects of the city council's choice.
Okay.
Which I get entirely, and I'm okay with that. There's just no price tag on anything.
Or water gallons, what the savings would be. I think we have to come up with what's our threshold in terms of desired savings. I mean, we can probably do several projects that will be aesthetically pleasing, but if they don't yield
The return.
yeah, then it's what's the point?
Yeah, again, I'm okay with reduction. I just don't have those projects spelled out, and not just the cost, but what the savings would be to our community, and in the long run, not just the immediate, because I don't think we're going to see an immediate savings. I think when we start talking about actual gallons used or saved, actual dollars saved because of the projects that we implement would actually save our community or save our city dollars. It may be, there may be a project or two in there that becomes critical to this council, that as much as we want to reduce to the ratepayer, these are some very critical projects that would serve our city well. For instance, the water storage. And I know that's not on this particular one here, but I'm just saying that was also a project that was a long time coming that probably should have been discussed years ago. So I don't necessarily want to kick down the road and say, let's just put these projects off and come back. That's kind of what's got us in this issue in the first place. Mayor Pro Tem.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out also that, I don't know if our conservation rebates have really been utilized completely. So you're already factoring in that on a 50% reduction, that you're $438,000 out, but really, you don't know how much of that rebate is really going to be utilized,
Right.
and/or the education materials. So I mean, assuming that they only use 15,000, you got $75,000 you can add back to that reserve, and potentially fund some of those projects. I'm not saying the 75 will do a $1 million project, but we'll have the flexibility to make those adjustments as time comes. And if that's something that's of dire need, then I'm sure that the council or future council can decide on that. But I think, I share the same sentiment that this council does, that, we're wanting to alleviate the ratepayer. And by reducing that to 50%, I think that would start somewhere. That would have a good start there. And we're not really taking away that capital improvement rate. We want to go back to that. I don't know. I think I would say, if anything, January would be the date, but I don't know how the rest of the council would feel. I don't know if they want to leave it flat and then shoot ourselves in the foot 5 years down the road, and we're not really looking at that capital improvement factor that they have, that 10% increase that was scheduled.
Is this a customer savings?
Yes, this is something that another schedule I put together that show with the current rates. So if there's a 50% reduction to customers with different water consumption levels, that's the savings that they would realize. 300 is a huge number of units of water to be used, but between 22 and 33 is basically the average consumption, somewhere in there. So when we go ahead and do the 10% increase, whenever council decides to do that, that would be offset partially by the 3.7% savings for somebody at 22 units, 5.1% savings for somebody with 33 units. Some of
On
these
the
using.
33 units, Tim, instead of, Darby, they were $88.79, they would pay $84.31? Is that?
Yes. Mhm. And those are today's rates, yes.
So savings is a savings. Anywhere we can save, I totally agree. And we need to, we certainly owe it to the ratepayer after the rates that we've set in place over the last 3 years or 4 years.
So coming back to the timing issue, if you decided to do the 50% reduction to water conservation, at the same time you do the 10% increase, then that'll offset the, they'll offset each other for some of these using basically 60 units of water. Because those are the higher users are the ones that get hit most with water conservation charges. So just something else to consider. This is something I put together.
The
Hopefully that's
ratepayer will
helpful.
pay the same, we'll just have 50% less in conservation.
Yes.
Ish. Councilwoman Gallegos.
I think Tim answered my question. I was just making it clear that if we lowered the 50% in the water conservation, it would only really affect the ratepayers in tier 2 and 3.
Yes. Yes, and all these examples have a little bit in tier 2 at least.
That's what the majority of the.
But the average, somewhere around 25 is the average use, and speaking with Ann and Eric earlier.
Councilman Oliver.
We heard a lot of different ideas tonight, and then we also heard about, as we move forward with our storage project, bringing on our consultants or experts to help devise the plan, so to speak, that, there may be some different engineering specs based on capacity and usage, or consumption. So I think a question I want to pose is, do we think it's still advantageous to move forward with the 10% increase, knowing that there may be a possibility of a decrease in the project costs that we're anticipating? That was kind of a significant, I would say development, but option that we heard earlier from staff, so.
I think the 10% would still be in effect because even if you reduce that cost, then your bond issuance goes down. But yet so you get less proceeds, and it's kind of almost like a wash. You still have your debt obligation that goes up a little bit, but not to the same extent. But you're already doing fine on operating. It was really just the capital that was the main driver and the reserves. So I did show a scenario where we did that, and it showed that with the 10, you still need the 10% to cover your debt obligations and maintain reserves.
So you're recommending the 10%, 50% reduction conservation, January 1 is a target date.
Yes, that's correct. I was showing January 1st as the target date. If you did 50% sooner, it's going to be nominal. It's not really going to change
Right,
the
and
needle much at all.
That was the next point I was going to make. The council is certainly aware that the ratepayer is in mind and they want to do something immediate. And I can appreciate that. I think it's a good point. But we can't implement that until November. It's just a couple of months difference. It's nominal, in your words.
I wouldn't bring back, here's the impact of 2 months of reducing it. It's
I wouldn't
pretty
make
much
you
the
do
same.
that. I wouldn't make you do that. So it's at the discretion of the council. Yes, Mayor Pro Tem.
While you're up there,
Stay
would
up
you
here.
mind, Habib,
Yes.
to showing us that slide where you don't have the 10% and you have a 50% reduction on the conservation? And maybe the question for you, Tim, after that is, what does that look like as far as your average user, as far as what he saves? Did you factor that in there when I saw that last slide in there? Was that adding the 10%?
That was not adding to the 10%.
That was not.
That was just today's rates that he was showing.
Okay, perfect. Okay, just want to make sure. So
Just to clarify, I was just showing that those percentage of savings would help to offset the 10% increase.
Okay.
So it goes back to what you're thinking, that it would really become a wash as
Yes.
opposed to that 3% savings. That 3% would be offset by the 10%. So it would
Yes,
be a
but
wash.
having, leaving the rates the way they are today, not implementing that 10% and that 50% reduction in conservation, what does that look like? And I think you answered the question when Councilman Oliver asked you, but what does that look like in your chart, and where do we start seeing some issues? So,
So I would say your bond coverage is okay because it is trending upward, which I think your financial advisor would view that as being okay, and knowing that you have to do another rate study later on. You do see that your reserves are going down, mainly to fund this capital, and it really takes a hit during 2025 where it spikes up. And I do have 4%, so then if I want to show what's the impact, I would think I would have to, yeah, so the next 5 years, we're looking at 6% revenue adjustments instead of 4%, with years outside of that next 5 years at 3%, which is kind of sort of CPI. You're building it back up slowly. But essentially 2% compounded over 5 years, that's more than 10%.
yeah.
That's an additional probably about 14% that you're tacking on for delaying the 10% that is scheduled now. And you already delayed us. We're already showing that's being delayed 6 months.
Yeah,
You're gonna pay for it sooner than later.
yeah.
Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you, Habib.
You're welcome. So that's not my recommendation.
But it is your chart's recommendation.
Yes,
No.
that's correct.
Mhm. Okay, so back to Dave's ask of direction. I'm good. I'm okay either way. I think we have the best interest of our ratepayer in mind. I think we're certainly aware that there's some projects out there that need to be done. It's going to certainly be more discussion in another council meeting. You're absolutely right. It's going to be an ongoing discussion. I think that really is my main concern. If we do the 50% reduction, it's just hard for me to say a reduction without knowing what those costs, priorities, and the effect that they'll have on our community. I'd like to see that information, is all I was asking, whether we do reduction or not.
Well,
So we could,
Good to go with the 50%.
yeah, I'm good to go with the 50% reduction.
okay, so you're talking immediate?
Yes.
Yeah, 50% reduction on the immediate. Councilman Robinson, you're okay with that?
Well, because, the state is still going to, be in effect about groundwater sustainability. We have to implement what they want.
Oh, sure, this is gonna be an ongoing discussion, that's for sure. I mean, with Sigma and future developments and choices, this is just the tip of the iceberg. But I think with where we're going on the immediate, to try to do whatever we can to save as quickly as we can for our ratepayer, and then understand that there's a cost to these projects. We're not sure what they are yet. We'll have an opportunity to discuss it, to prioritize it.
Yeah, so you just want to stabilize it.
Yeah, that would be a good word, sure, sure.
So just to clarify, we can bring back that rate adjustment probably in November. Or we can proceed as Habib described, which is to implement both adjustments at the same time and target that for January. If we did the latter, would that be, then I think we'd be looking at sometime returning to you, most likely in December, for the administrative approval of the rate adjustment, and then it would then go into effect in January. Is that sufficient, or do you want us to bring it back in November to implement? And let me look at Tim just to make sure that I haven't overcommitted on how quickly we can implement an adjustment once it's,
So Habib, you're saying that if we reduce 50% and increase a 10%, it will be a wash?
it would not be a wash, but
Pretty
it would
close.
be, it would
It won't be like a,
lessen the
"Ugh."
intensity of the 10%. Otherwise, you're going to get a little bit of a reduction and then it's going to go back up again, depending on people's usage patterns.
And keep in mind, it is the winter months, and so people's usage should be predominant.
Well, one of,
Well, no, we're getting all shower heads.
yeah. Well, one of the things I want to keep in mind as well, which is the reason why I wanted that information in the first place, is this council then has to be prepared to take a look at that information that's going to be prepared to us, to see that possibly some of these projects we want to implement immediate. Are we then going to say, let's go back to 100% conservation because those projects are top priority and we need to maintain a certain level of conservation dollars? That question would be posed to us.
Yes.
And so I'm just going to ask, as long as council is open-minded enough to understand that we may have to have this discussion again soon, in the next 3 to 6 months, and then have to prioritize that, again, these projects are just too important to put off, and we can't quite get there with the conservation dollars that we are implementing at 50%.
I just feel like if they were that important, Mr. Mayor, it would have been brought up to us a lot sooner than today.
Yeah, I agree.
Had some,
I agree.
some better numbers with it.
I agree, and not only this report this evening, I think to Councilman Oliver's report, it's something that should have been an ongoing discussion. No, I totally agree.
I'm okay at 50%.
Okay. So I think your timeline is fine.
Okay,
John's.
I think
Oh, I'm
we're-
sorry.
Okay, John?
So unless you tell me differently, let me put it that way. We will work on implementing all of the changes at once, and we'll implement it in the first part of January, consistent with what the consultant recommended. Is that sufficient?
You'll bring it back to us in December for approval and?
Yes.
Okay. Yep.
I don't know if I'm okay with that 10% in January. If we could hold till the middle June. Is that when we were originally doing our increases in June? It was January every year?
Yeah, it's every
Would
July
have
1.
been July,
July
yeah,
1,
would have been
that's
July
what-
1st. We just,
if we could
we just
hold
deferred
July
it
1.
from July of 2018. So the increase that was scheduled in July was deferred.
Right.
And so the question that we have looked at is whether we could continue to push that out all the way until July 1st of 2019. And Habib is basically saying it doesn't help. It doesn't get us where we want to be. That if that's what you want to do, you can certainly direct us to do that, and we'll adjust the best we can.
5% or 6% and 6%?
Split it in half.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Can we do
Yeah.
like a-
One thing that a lot of agencies do, I know you can do it on July 1st, but based on where we are, the desert area, I'm in Temecula, I'm somewhat in the desert area. Doing it in January is also beneficial for your customers because it is the low use winter months. So they don't see much of an impact because tier 2 and tier 3 isn't used as much. Whereas when you do it in summer, that's right when they ramp up their usage and they get tacked on that 10%. You now have 6 months for them to get used to that 10%, which is then offset by the conservation. It makes it a lot more palatable to your customers to be able to absorb that and see if they need to change their behavior before it gets into those hotter months where they start increasing their usage.
If we are slated to implement a 10% and then at 1920 a 3%, what if that was split in half, a 6 and a 7 or a 6 and a 6?
Compound.
You could, yeah. I mean, that's possible. Another thing you could do is revisit the 3%, whether it needs to be done in July. Right now, my performa shows it in July, but again, we're now at the lowest adjustment of 3%. 3% over a year isn't significant dollars. I would imagine you're also going to revisit, just as part of your budgetary process, how's everything looking?
Sure. So is that a yes on the split? And is that something that council would like to see? To Councilwoman's point, I certainly wouldn't favor a complete zero of the 10%, but
Right.
if something's more palatable, 50% reduction, if we did a 6 or 6.5% or something January 1 for 12 months and then January 1 of 2020, the same, another 6% or whatever we agree upon.
I'm good with that.
Does that get us to where we want to go in the next 2 years?
It would
Or
be
is
a
that
li-
rate structure?
it would be a little bit lower than what I was projecting, which was already low in the outer years. So again, it's going to impact what's going to be the decisions made by the next council and the next cost of service analysis. I would recommend, if you are going to split it, I recommend it's split this January 19 and July 19.
You can't.
Unless you're going to always, moving forward, do your rate adjustments every January. Because there's going to be 1 year where you're going to, if you want to get back
Gotta
in there,
choose,
you're going to have to
yeah.
do 2 adjustments in 1 calendar year. So I would recommend doing it when you're splitting it, and then you're back to, okay, now the next study, let's see what we need to do every July.
But if we're splitting it, are you saying 6% January 1 to June 30 and then
And
July
then-
1
Correct.
for 12 months, but it would still be a 6%?
It's 12 in a year.
Well, it's
Yes.
10 and 3 if we don't.
Sort of, to a certain extent. I mean, I would say yes. It's like that, but it's really driven by what was the rate actually shown on the notice.
Right.
But when you're splitting it, it's a little bit different. But just the final rate would be in effect July 1st, 2019 of your rate schedule.
And technically, we could consider the last 6 months a savings as well, since we have not implemented that 10% from July 1.
Yes.
Rates should have gone up, and they haven't in 6 months. So there's
There's already savings
already a savings.
for the 6 months we're in right now. I hope I answered your question. Or if, yes, Councilmember Rodriguez.
I'm sorry, Mayor Pro Tem.
Yes, so, I think you brought up a good point, Habib, where, the impact on the ratepayers would not be as big if you implemented that in January. Obviously, you want to try to help the ratepayer as much as you can. I think by reducing the 50% on the conservation, I think that kind of keeps everything status quo. And I don't know that they'll see an impact come July, but I'm curious to see how the council would feel about that 10%. I know I would hate for them to take it on July of 2019 when their biggest peak of water consumption is there, and then we hit them with that. And not only that, but also adding to your compound effect of what that does for us down the road. I mean, that's the only other question that I would have. I think the biggest thing is our conservation, which I thought, was a little bit off. I mean, we have over $1.2 million in reserve, so reducing that, I mean, would be a nominal impact, but nevertheless, it's an impact.
I'd like that as well, Mayor Pro Tem. To your point, this last year, when we had 32 out of 35 days that were triple digit, it was right at that end of June, all of July, and then July 1, the rate increase was supposed to hit. And so it certainly did not help anything politically.
Right.
And so I know that could be a different discussion some other time, but it certainly makes things easier if a new rate takes effect on January 1 versus July 1.
I just didn't show you the impact of what's being proposed now, and I could do so just so if we do January, split the difference. I haven't shown that.
You don't see it?
Yeah, let's
Okay.
let's
let's
see it.
Maybe like 8% January and then 5% the next.
I was gonna say 7 and 6.
6 3/4.
Just give me 1 second. You gave me a curveball, so I need to.
We're good at that.
Stumped them. Wait till it gets to 10:30. We'll throw another one out.
Yeah.
John knows it, right, John? You know how it goes, right? I'm gonna grab some.
Dinner, what's that?
Mayor's buying dinner.
Yeah, if we can agree on this percentage, I will.
Okay, again, this is now the impact. I still have the 4%, I still have the 3%, and you're still fine all the way through 2024. Again, this is with the reserve targets reduced, and then it's really these later years in 2025 through 2028 where you're hovering around 4 million instead of 6 million. Which is another study. Well, actually, the 25 and 26, 1, 2, 3, 4, 26 is in the next study.
Played a lot of today. Might not be there, man.
So just to re-summarize, this is conservation at 50%, rate adjustment in January at 6% instead of 10%, which was already delayed which was supposed to go into effect last July, and then getting to the final rates of your current rate schedule in January 2020.
Yes.
At what percent?
Yeah, I'm not sure what percent it is, but I know these were your final rates.
6 and 6.
But it's really not 6 and 6,
Well,
just
yeah,
because. So that's why I don't see percent here. Just this is your
Okay.
final year of that was on the schedule. Yeah, I could do that. So, just in general, it's like a 7%
So 15
increase.
cents.
But what's important, the reason why I'm not doing that is because it's not the percent, it's what was actually published in the notice. Even though we use percentages to drive it,
Yeah.
it's the numbers. Because you might decide, like you did now, delay the rate increase. And say you delay for a full year, that doesn't mean you're limited to 10% next year. That means you're limited to all the way up to 1688 because that was the year, that was the rates for that next year.
Yeah.
Your ceiling always goes up.
So we got to get to the rate.
Yeah, you're allowed to get up to the full rate for that year. Okay?
Yeah, that's less than $1 increase.
Yeah, this last one is pretty minimal.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Good.
Where are we at now? I'm sorry. Are we at 6% now? Is that
You
where
checking
we're
your,
6 and
checking your
50.
lotto's numbers or what, man?
at? I am. Because
Well,
if
if
I
you
win,
win, you're paying
if
for
I
half
win, I'll
this
make
stuff.
I'll give you guys the other 50%.
Jeez.
First year.
We're at 50% drop, decrease in conservation,
Just changes this one doesn't change.
6% increase.
Well, it's already
6.
projected. It's already projected. We're just gonna.
I would call it a 4% decrease,
doesn't
which
really
actually
do
is more than that because
Just
we've
a
already
6.
Oh, yeah.
credited them what should have been a 10% increase for 6 months.
Right. Correct.
And so there's that credit, which I won't make you factor in, but there's certainly a credit. And then another 4% reduction on top of that.
That is a very good point because if you look at it in terms of what was my annual obligation as a ratepayer, they're not really seeing a 6% increase in their total cost because you already gave them a 0 increase for 6 months. So really that 6% over the next 6 months is really like a 3% increase over the course of the 12 months of this fiscal year.
Yeah,
It-
but they're not going to see that.
I don't have my calculator, but I don't even think it's going to be that much.
You're probably correct because the first half of the year is when the maximum usage is
Yeah,
up.
January to June, there's
Right.
no triple digits. And so January to April or May, I think other cities, they just have a one-day watering week. So July to September is where the money is.
Right, correct.
So I think that even a 6% increase is going to end up a net no increase at all for 12 months. Give or take a point or two.
Yeah, it may be less than 3%, probably 2%.
So as we reach out to our constituency, that would be the story that I would tell.
Sticking to it.
Mr. Merchant, you got
I saw some
direction?
enthusiasm from most of the council members. So what I think I heard, is bring back in December for action to implement in January the 50% reduction in the conservation program and a 6% adjustment to the overall rates. We'll do those together and implement them at the same time.
I'm sorry, it's not a 6% adjustment, it's a 4% decrease.
Yes.
All right?
That too.
Okay, that's what I want. Just gonna get our numbers right, because that's what you said, right? Okay.
And understanding that we have a new city manager that should be here in December, possibly, as well as we only have a handful of meetings left. So I understand we have a lot on our plate. Dave, you have a lot on your plate. But as soon as we can get those numbers and the projects and some of the detail that was asked of you this evening.
We'll absolutely be working on it.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you. Anything else? Thank you very, very much for that insight. We look forward to the next 60 days and then moving forward after that. I think we really hit a happy medium between what our obligations are, the ratepayer, and what capital improvement projects that are on the horizon for the city of Madera. I think we're right there.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much.
I'll tell you what needs to get on video is that recap that Habib does as to how.
Oh,
we got
yeah,
to
no,
where
that was
we
really
are.
cool.
Yeah.
We kind of put you on the spot and you're doing your numbers just on the fly. Very impressed with that. Thank you very much.
That's great.
Yeah. But the contract's still as is. Don't ask for any increase or anything, okay? Moving on to council reports. I'll start at my left with Mayor Pro Tem Rodriguez.
I don't have any reports, Mr. Mayor, but I did want to remind some of the council that tomorrow there is that walk to the Washington, I think, Elementary, and I'll let you kind of fill in the details there. I also did want to tell you that I did play the lotto, and obviously I didn't win because I'm still here.
Yeah.
But if any of you guys played, good luck, and don't forget about me.
Would say who?
Yeah, I'll say what?
I'm going to remember. Councilman Oliver.
I have nothing really to report, Mr. Mayor. I'd just like to thank staff and Habib for bringing back this presentation. And I really do think this is something we should bring back at least annually and especially tell that story, providing that frame of reference as to where we've come from and where we're going, and that we're trying to make the best decisions that we can to make decisions a little bit easier for future councils, most importantly. So that's all I have.
Great, thank you very much. Councilwoman Gallegos.
I had nothing to report.
Councilman Rigby.
Nothing to report.
And my apologies, Councilman Robinson is detained, and I have nothing to report other than a thank you to staff, everybody who's here. Really appreciate your input and your dedication to the team. With that, Mr. Hale, I will ask for an announcement. Thank you.
Honorable Mayor and Council, you're about to convene in closed session. This is in regards to a conference with labor negotiators pursuant to Government Code 54957.6. Agency designated representatives are David Merchant, Annie Medillion, Jose Rodriguez, Donald Hawley, and the unrepresented positions to be discussed are city manager, city attorney, and city clerk.
Thank you very much.
We have any
Mr.
more?
Hale, we have a quorum. Please go right
Okay.
ahead.
Great. Honorable Mayor and Council, at this point in time, we have no reportable actions out of closed session.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you. Meeting adjourned.